the fading light of the Roman world, history becomes a strange and murky thing. A general in Britain can be proclaimed emperor by his troops, only to have his head decorating a spike in Rome a few months later. Entire peoples, numbering in the tens of thousands, can appear on a frozen river one winter, cross into the heart of the empire, and effectively vanish from the historical record. It's a time when a group of tribal warriors, known as the Franks, a name whose origin historians still argue about, whether it means the fierce or is named after their favorite throwing axe, the Francisca, can be both the empire's most troublesome border raiders and its most reliable source of elite soldiers, sometimes in the same week. This is a world where allegiances are as fluid as the Rhine in springtime, and where the future of a continent is being decided not in marbled Senate halls, but in the damp, misty forests of Northern Europe. The story we are about to drift into is one of an idea, the idea of a unified Christian empire that was born from the ashes of Rome, forged by these very warriors, and would flicker, fade, and blaze for 1,000 years, shaping the world we know in ways we rarely comprehend. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, so drop your city and local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see this little community of night owls and history buffs stretching across the globe. Our story begins quietly, not with a bang, but with a slow, creeping settlement along the northern frontier of a tired, overstretched Roman Empire. By the 3rd and 4th centuries after Christ, Rome was a giant showing its age. Its borders were vast, its bureaucracy was bloated, and the very idea of what it meant to be Roman was becoming diluted. The legions that patrolled the great river borders, the Rhine and the Danube, were increasingly filled with men who had been born outside the empire. They were barbarians, hired to fight other barbarians, a pragmatic policy that felt a bit like hiring a pack of wolves to guard the henhouse. Among the most prominent of these groups were the Franks. They weren't a single unified nation, but a loose confederation of smaller Germanic tribes, the Sugambri, the Bructeri, the Chatti, who lived in the marshy, densely wooded lands just east of the Rhine. Forced together by pressure from other migrating peoples and the magnetic pull of Roman wealth, they coalesced into two main groups. There were the Ripuarian Franks, the riverbank Franks, who lived along the middle stretch of the Rhine, near modern-day Cologne. And then there were the Salian Franks, the salty Franks, who occupied the coastal lands near the mouth of the Rhine. It is this second group, the Salians, that our story will follow most closely. For generations, the relationship between these Franks and the Romans was a messy cycle of raiding and recruitment. A Frankish warband might swim the river at night, sack a poorly defended villa, and carry off cattle and silver, only for their cousins to enlist in a Roman auxiliary unit the following spring, drawn by the promise of regular pay, good equipment, and a path to citizenship. The Romans, for their part, recognized the Franks' raw martial talent. They were fierce, loyal when paid, and made excellent infantrymen. So, Rome began a policy of settling them within the imperial frontier. Groups of Franks were granted land in northern Gaul as federati or federates. In exchange for this land, they were obligated to defend it against any other invaders. They became a buffer, a first line of defense. This was a slow process of immigration, not a sudden conquest. Frankish families tilled Roman soil. Their children grew up hearing Latin in the marketplace, and their best warriors rose high in the Roman military command. A Frankish leader named Arbogast became the effective ruler of the Western Roman Empire. For a time in the late 300s, a powerful general who made and unmade emperors. The Franks were becoming part of the Roman system. Even as that system was beginning to crumble from within, they maintained their own distinct culture, however. While they might wear Roman mail and use Roman swords, they clung to their own language, their pagan gods, and their unique customs. Most famously, their chieftains and nobles kept their hair long, believing it to be the source of their power and good fortune, a tradition that would give their first royal dynasty its name. They were a people caught between two worlds, Roman in service, but Germanic in soul, living in the twilight of one age and the dawn of another. The breaking point arrived on the last day of the year 406. The Rhine River froze solid. It was an invitation that the peoples massing on the far bank could not refuse. A vast wave of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi poured across the ice into Gaul, shattering the Roman frontier defenses. The Franks, as Federati, fought to stem the tide, but the breach was too great. The Roman administration in northern Gaul effectively collapsed. Legions were withdrawn to deal with threats closer to home. Governors fled, and the tax collectors, presumably, found other career opportunities. Into this power vacuum stepped the local Frankish leaders. They had the land, they had the warriors, and they were already there. The Roman villas and towns of northern Gaul needed a protector, and the Frankish warlords were the only ones left who could do the job. They went from being tenants and security guards to being the new landlords. From this chaos of collapse, a new order began to emerge, centered on strong men who could command loyalty through strength of arms and the distribution of plunder. These were men like the semi-mythical Clodio, the long-haired king, who is said to have led the Salian Franks from their marshy homelands to capture the Roman city of Tournai, making it his capital. The old world was dying, and a new one, defined by the sword and personal loyalty, was taking shape. And it was into this violent, uncertain world that a boy named Clovis was born, a direct descendant of these warrior chiefs, who would prove to be more ambitious, more cunning, and far more brutal than anyone who had come before him. The young man who inherited this fractured kingdom in 481 was named Clovis. He was perhaps 15 years old, a boy king in a world that had little time for boys, and even less for weak kings. He ruled the Salian Franks from Tournai, but his authority extended only as far as his warriors could throw their axes. To survive, let alone prosper, he would have to be more cunning, more ambitious, and more merciless than the grizzled warlords who surrounded him. An early story, perhaps embellished but certainly telling, reveals the kind of man he was becoming. After a successful raid on a church near Soissons, his war band was dividing the loot in the customary way, by casting lots. A local bishop sent a desperate plea to Clovis, begging for the return of one particular item, a large, sacred vase. Clovis, already thinking about winning the loyalty of the powerful Gallo-Roman clergy, agreed and asked his warriors for the vase as his share. Most of the men grumbled, but consented. A king had a right to a special prize. But one warrior, fiercely protective of the old ways, stepped forward, declared that Clovis would get nothing more than what the Lords gave him, and smashed the beautiful vase to pieces with his battle axe. Clovis, we are told, said nothing. He swallowed his rage and pocketed the insult. But he did not forget. A year later, during a military inspection, he came upon the same warrior. The king found fault with the man's weapons, claiming they were poorly kept, and threw them to the ground. As the warrior bent over to pick them up, Clovis raised his own axe and split the man's skull, calmly remarking, "Thus you did to the vase at Soissons." The message to his army was as clear as the blood soaking into the dirt. The old ways of a warrior collective were over. There was now one authority, one will that mattered. His. With his Franks cowed into obedience, Clovis turned his gaze outward. To the south lay the domain of Syagrius, a Roman official who styled himself King of the Romans and ruled a large enclave around Paris, a last isolated fragment of the Western Empire. In 486, Clovis marched his army against him. The battle was decisive. Syagrius fled, was captured, and was quietly executed. With one stroke, Clovis had doubled his territory and absorbed the heartland of northern Gaul. He was no longer just a tribal chieftain. He was a major territorial ruler, but conquest by the sword was only half the game. Clovis understood the need for alliances, and he made his most important one through marriage. He took as his wife the Burgundian princess Clotilde. Crucially, though her people were mostly Arian Christians, Clotilde herself was a devout Nicene Catholic, the faith of the old Gallo-Roman aristocracy. The people Clovis now ruled, she worked tirelessly to convert her pagan husband, who respectfully resisted, hedging his bets with the old gods who had served his ancestors so well. He allowed his children to be baptized, but he himself remained unconvinced. His gods were gods of war and victory. What could this new, peaceful god offer him? He would get his answer on the battlefield. Around the year 496, Clovis found himself locked in a desperate struggle against the Alemanni, another Germanic confederation pressing into Gaul from the east. At the Battle of Tolbiac, the fighting was going badly. The Frankish lines were buckling, and for the first time, Clovis's army was on the verge of complete collapse. In that moment of desperation, with his warriors falling around him, Clovis did what so many have done in moments of ultimate crisis. He made a bargain with a higher power. Lifting his eyes to the heavens, he prayed aloud, not to Odin or the gods of the forest, but to the god of his wife, Clotilde. He swore that if Jesus Christ would grant him victory, he would believe and be baptized. And at that moment, so the story goes, the tide of the battle turned. The Alemanni king was struck down, and his leaderless army lost heart and fled the field. Clovis had his victory, and now he had a promise to keep. Historians still argue whether his conversion was a moment of genuine faith or a masterstroke of political calculation. But in truth, it was probably both. On Christmas Day, likely in the year 496, Clovis, along with 3,000 of his warriors, was baptized by Bishop Remigius in the cathedral at Reims. As he entered the church, dazzlingly decorated with silks and filled with the scent of incense, the pagan king was said to be overwhelmed. Bishop Remigius famously declared, "Bow your head, proud sycamore. Adore what you have burned. Burn what you have adored." The political genius of this act cannot be overstated. All the other Germanic kings in the West, the Goths in Spain and Italy, the Vandals in Africa, were Arian Christians, a branch of the faith deemed heretical by the Catholic Church. By embracing Nicene Catholicism, Clovis instantly became the only legitimate Christian king in the eyes of the vast Gallo-Roman population of Gaul. He was no longer just a barbarian conqueror. He was a champion of the true faith, an instrument of God's will. The bishops, who commanded immense wealth, loyalty, and administrative skill, now threw their full support behind him. This newfound divine approval seemed to energize his campaigns of unification. He drove the Arian Visigoths out of southern Gaul after a great victory at Vouillé in 507. But he also turned his attention to the other Frankish kings, many of whom were his own relatives. His methods were brutally efficient, a masterclass in what one might call aggressive family consolidation. He secretly encouraged the son of another Frankish king to murder his father, promising him the kingdom. Once the deed was done, Clovis sent his own men to kill the son, declaring that patricide was a terrible crime, and then absorbed the dead men's kingdom. He would later lament, with what one imagines was a theatrical sigh, that he was left like a traveler among strangers, with no family left to help him in times of trouble. A problem he himself had created with methodical assassinations. By the time of his death in 511, this ruthless, brilliant warlord had united all the Frankish tribes under his sole rule, established Paris as his capital, and forged a new kingdom that fused Germanic military power with Roman administrative structures and Catholic religious authority. He had created the Merovingian dynasty, named for his mythical ancestor, Merovech, and laid the foundations of a kingdom that would, centuries later, become France. Clovis had forged a kingdom, but he had left it with a fatal flaw, a piece of cultural programming that would ensure it could never remain whole for long. The Franks did not share the Roman concept of a state, a res publica, that was an indivisible public entity. To them, a kingdom was the king's personal property, and like any property, it was to be divided equally among his male heirs upon his death. It was a business model destined for failure, ensuring that every generation would have to start the bloody process of consolidation all over again. And so, upon Clovis's death in 511, his great achievement was immediately fractured, split into four smaller kingdoms for his four sons, with capitals at Reims, Orléans, Paris, and Soissons. Initially, the brothers managed a degree of cooperation, working together to conquer the kingdom of the Burgundians and expand the Frankish domain. But the bonds of brotherhood were thin, and the scent of power was thick. The story of the Merovingians for the next 2 centuries is a grim, repetitive cycle of civil war, treachery, and assassination. The most chilling episode, one that perfectly captures the era's brutality, involves the sons of Clodomir, one of the original 4 brothers. When Clodomir was killed in battle, his 3 young sons were left in the care of their grandmother, the pious Clotilde, the same queen who had brought Catholicism to Clovis. Her other two surviving sons, Childebert and Clothar, saw their young nephews not as family, but as obstacles. They sent a messenger to their mother, the aged queen, with two items: a pair of shears and a naked sword. The message was implicit and horrifying. She could choose to have her grandson's hair cut. Remember that long hair, the symbol of their royal power, effectively tonsuring them, disqualifying them from the throne, and sending them to a monastery. Or she could choose the sword. The queen, in a fit of grief and despair, is said to have cried out that she would rather see them dead than stripped of their birthright. It was the answer the uncles had hoped for. Clothar seized the eldest boy, just 10 years old, threw him to the floor, and plunged a dagger into his side. The younger brother, terrified, clung to Childebert's knees, begging for his life. For a moment, Childebert, his face wet with tears, seemed to waver, pleading with Clothar to stop. But Clothar furiously accused him of cowardice, reminding him that this was his own plan. Shamed into compliance, Childebert pushed the little boy away, and Clothar murdered him as well. The third boy managed to escape and would live out his life in obscurity as a holy man. This was Merovingian family politics, a zero-sum game played with daggers in the halls of power. Occasionally, one brother would prove ruthless and long-lived enough to eliminate all the others, reuniting the Frankish realm under a single crown, as Clothar did. But upon his death in 561, the kingdom was simply divided again among his four sons, and the cycle of violence began anew. This next generation's conflict was defined by two of the most formidable women in early medieval history: Queen Brunhilda of the Eastern Kingdom of Austrasia and Queen Fredegund of the Northwestern Kingdom of Neustria. Their feud, which lasted for over 40 years, was both deeply personal and intensely political. It began when Fredegund, a palace servant of mesmerizing charm and ambition, persuaded her lover, King Chilperic of Neustria, to set aside his new wife, Galsvintha. Galsvintha happened to be Brunhilda's sister. Soon after being dismissed, Galsvintha was found strangled in her bed, and Chilperic promptly married Fredegund. Brunhilda, a highly intelligent and capable Visigothic princess, swore revenge, igniting a war between the kingdoms that would outlive nearly all the initial participants, fueled by an endless series of assassinations orchestrated by the brilliant and utterly ruthless Fredegund. Bishops, dukes, and rival royals were dispatched by poisoned daggers, tainted communion wine, and seductive agents. It was a saga of unbelievable cruelty that bled the kingdoms of men and treasure, culminating decades later in Brunhilda's own horrific death. Captured in her 70s by Fredegund's son, Clothar II, the old queen was accused of murdering 10 kings of the Franks, tortured for 3 days, and then tied by her hair and one foot to the tail of an untamed horse, which was then spurred to gallop, tearing her body apart. This constant, gruesome infighting had a slow, corrosive effect on the power of the monarchy itself. To fight their wars, kings needed the loyalty of their aristocrats, their dukes and counts. Loyalty, in this era, was purchased with land. With each new crisis, each new civil war, the Merovingian kings granted more and more royal estates to their powerful nobles in exchange for military support. They were, in effect, giving away the very source of their wealth and power. Over generations, the royal family became progressively poorer, while the aristocracy grew ever richer and more powerful, ruling their own vast domains like petty kings. The monarchs themselves, the descendants of the fearsome Clovis, began to fade into the background. They became known to later history as the Au revoir fainéants, the do-nothing kings. Many modern historians now see this label as a successful piece of propaganda invented by the dynasty that would eventually supplant them. The later Merovingians weren't necessarily lazy or stupid. Their power had been structurally dismantled by generations of civil war and land grants. They became ritual figures, revered for their sacred, long-haired bloodline, but possessing little actual authority. Their chief function was symbolic, to be paraded before the people once a year in a rustic ox cart to ensure the fertility of the land and the prosperity of the kingdom. While the king was slowly trundling through the fields, the real business of government, of raising armies, collecting revenues, and making law, was increasingly falling into the hands of a new official, a man who held the most powerful office in the palace. This new official, the man holding the reins of the kingdom, was known as the mayor of the palace, or in Latin, the major domus, which translates as greatest man of the house. It's a title with a rather humble, domestic ring to it, like a glorified butler or chief of staff. But by the 7th century, calling this man a butler was like calling a modern CEO the office manager. The office had begun simply enough, as the supervisor of the king's household and manager of the vast royal estates. But as the Merovingian kings increasingly retreated from the day-to-day grind of governance to focus on their dynastic blood feuds, the mayor's powers grew. They controlled the royal budget. They were the gatekeepers of who got to see the king. And most importantly, they controlled the distribution of land and titles, the patronage that made the whole system run. Soon, ambitious nobles knew that the path to wealth and power ran not to the throne room, but to the mayor's office. The mayors also took command of the royal armies, leading the Frankish hosts into battle, while the king remained behind as a sacred, symbolic figurehead. In the separate Frankish kingdoms of Neustria, Burgundy, and Austrasia, powerful aristocratic families vied to make this influential office their own personal property. But it was in the northeastern kingdom of Austrasia, the old Frankish heartland, that one family achieved a lasting dominance. This clan, known to history as the Pippinids or the Arnulfings, was formed from a shrewd alliance in the early 600s between two of the most powerful men in the kingdom, Pippin of London, a wealthy aristocrat who became mayor of the palace, and Arnulf, the influential bishop of Metz. They pooled their immense landholdings and political influence to dominate the Austrasian court, an alliance they cemented by marrying Pippin's daughter, Bega, to Arnulf's son, and Segisel. From this union would spring a new dynasty, the Carolingians. Their power grew so great that they began to see the Merovingian kings not as their masters, but as mere puppets. Pippin of London's son, Grimoald the Elder, decided the time for subtlety was over. In a move that was both breathtakingly bold and politically premature, he attempted a direct coup. When the Austrasian king Sigebert III died in 656, Grimoald captured the king's young son and heir, Dagobert II had the boy's sacred long hair shorn off and shipped him off to a monastery in Ireland. He then placed his own son on the Austrasian throne, giving him the suitably royal-sounding name of Childebert the Adopted. But Grimoald had misjudged the mood of the Frankish elite. The other great nobles might resent the Merovingians, but they were not yet ready to see them replaced by one of their own. To them, Grimoald was an up-jumped peer, not a sacred king. The coup failed spectacularly. The rival kingdom of Neustria intervened, and Grimoald was captured, taken to Paris, and executed for treason. It was a harsh lesson for the family. The long-haired kings, however powerless, still possessed a mystical legitimacy that could not be easily brushed aside. Grasping for the crown itself was a fatal mistake. The true path to power was to rule through the king, not in place of him. After this disaster, the family's fortunes languished for a time, but they were restored by a descendant of that original Pippinid-Arnulfing union, a man named Pippin of Herstal. Canny, patient, and a brilliant military commander, Pippin II learned from his ancestors' mistake. He spent years consolidating his family's power base in Austrasia, building a formidable private army from his loyal followers. He then turned his attention to the rival kingdom of Neustria, whose own mayor was attempting to reassert control over the entire Frankish realm. The decisive showdown came in 687 at the Battle of Tetri. Pippin and his tough Austrasian warriors shattered the Neustrian army. This victory was a pivotal moment in Frankish history. Pippin marched on Paris, captured the Neustrian king, and had himself declared mayor of the palace for all the Frankish kingdoms. The realm was, for the first time, united not by a Merovingian king, but by a single, all-powerful mayor. Pippin of Herstal would rule as the master of the Franks for the next 27 years. He styled himself Dux et Princeps Francorum, Duke and Prince of the Franks, a title that broadcast his authority while carefully avoiding the taboo word king. He kept a succession of Merovingian monarchs on the throne, trotting them out for official ceremonies, allowing them to sign charters that he had written, and then sending them back to a comfortable obscurity on their country estates. It was a stable and effective arrangement. Pippin campaigned against the pagan Frisians and Alemanni, brought rebellious dukes to heel, and re-established Frankish authority throughout Gaul. He had all the power of a king, and he successfully passed that power down to his sons, treating the office of mayor as his own hereditary possession. The long-haired kings still reigned, but they no longer ruled. The center of gravity had shifted permanently from the throne to the mayor's palace. When Pippin died in 714, however, his carefully constructed order was thrown into chaos. His designated heir was a young grandson, but a far more formidable candidate was waiting in the wings. An illegitimate son, a man of ferocious energy and military genius who had been imprisoned by Pippin's widow to keep him from power. His name was Charles, and he would not remain in prison for long. Charles, the son of Pippin of Herstal, and his second wife or concubine, Alpeda, was the embodiment of the Pippinid family's ambition and strength. But at the moment of his father's death, he was powerless, locked away in a prison in Cologne by his father's first wife, Plectrude, who intended to rule as regent for her own young grandson. Frankish inheritance disputes, however, rarely stayed confined to legal arguments for long. The rival kingdom of Neustria, sensing a moment of weakness, immediately rebelled against Austrasian dominance. In the ensuing chaos, Charles escaped his confinement. He was a man with a famous name, but no army and no treasury. What he did have was a formidable military mind and a magnetic presence that drew disgruntled Austrasian warriors to his side. In a series of brilliant, lightning-fast campaigns, he outmaneuvered and defeated both the Neustrian rebels and the forces loyal to Plectrude. By 718, Charles had firmly secured his father's position as mayor of the palace for the entire Frankish realm. He was a master of the battlefield, a pragmatist who understood that power in this world grew from the point of a sword. He would soon need every ounce of that military genius, because a new and formidable power was pressing on the southern border of his kingdom. In the century since the death of the Prophet Muhammad, the armies of the Islamic Caliphate had expanded with breathtaking speed, conquering the Persian Empire, the Middle East, and all of North Africa. In 711, a Berber and Arab force crossed the narrow strait of water from Africa to Spain, which they called Al-Andalus. The Visigothic kingdom that had ruled Spain for 3 centuries crumbled in a single battle. Within a decade, the Umayyad Caliphate controlled almost the entire Iberian Peninsula, and their raiding parties began to probe north across the Pyrenees Mountains into the Frankish Duchy of Aquitaine. For years, these raids had been a persistent but manageable problem. But in 732, the governor of Al-Andalus, a respected commander named Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, gathered a massive army and launched a full-scale expedition into Gaul. His objective was likely not permanent conquest, but a grand plundering tour, with the ultimate prize being the fabulously wealthy abbey of St. Martin of Tours. Abidi al-Rahman's army of cavalry swept through Aquitaine, crushed the local duke's army at the Battle of the River Garonne, and sacked the city of Bordeaux. The survivors fled north, carrying terrifying tales of an unstoppable host. Charles, understanding the gravity of the threat, began to gather his own army. He summoned his loyal Austrasian veterans, a tough, disciplined force of professional infantrymen, funded by his controversial confiscations of church land. He marched south, but refused to be drawn into a hasty battle. He let Abd al-Rahman's army advance deep into Francia, its baggage train growing heavier with plunder, its lines of communication stretching ever longer. Charles carefully chose his ground on a wooded, elevated plain somewhere between the cities of Poitiers and Tours, placing his men in a position that would be difficult for cavalry to attack. For several days, the two armies watched each other, skirmishing in the autumn chill. Finally, Abd al-Rahman, confident in his superior numbers and the proven strength of his horsemen, ordered a full assault. The Umayyad cavalry charged the Frankish lines again and again, but they could not break them. A contemporary Spanish chronicle described Charles's infantry as a solid, unmovable block of men, standing like a wall of ice, absorbing the shock of the charges on their heavy shields and cutting down the horsemen with their swords and axes. The battle raged all day, a bloody stalemate. The turning point came late in the afternoon. Charles had sent a scouting force to circle around and attack the Umayyad camp, where the army's immense treasure was kept. when word spread through Abd al-Rahman's ranks that their plunder was threatened. Many of the cavalrymen broke off from the main fight and galloped back to protect their loot. A reminder that threatening an army's bonus is always a powerful tactic. This movement caused chaos in the Umayyad lines, and many mistook it for a general retreat. Abd al-Rahman rode into the confusion, trying to rally his men, and was surrounded and killed. As darkness fell, the fighting subsided. The Franks, exhausted, remained in their defensive square, expecting the battle to resume at dawn. But when the morning mists cleared, they found the enemy camp deserted. The Umayyad army, leaderless and demoralized, had slipped away during the night, leaving their tents and their treasure behind. Historians still argue whether the Battle of Tours was the decisive turning point that saved Europe, or a significant but ultimately exaggerated victory against what was essentially a large-scale raid. What is undeniable is that it was a massive victory for Charles. It shattered the aura of Umayyad invincibility, permanently halted their advance into the heart of Francia, and left Charles as the undisputed military master of the West. It was from this period that he earned his legendary nickname, Martellus, Charles the Hammer. In the following years, he hammered the borders of the kingdom, subjugating the Burgundians, driving Umayyad garrisons from Provence, and securing the Frankish realm. He was a king in all but name, an undefeated commander who had created a state funded by a professional army. Yet, like his father, he never took the crown. When he died in 741, he was the master of a united and powerful kingdom, and he bequeathed that power not to the phantom Merovingian king, but to his own two sons, Carloman and Pippin. The stage was now set for the final act of the Pippinid family's long and patient rise. Charles the Hammer had left his vast, unofficial kingdom to his two sons, Carloman and Pippin. The two brothers, unlike the Merovingian siblings of old, initially worked together with surprising harmony. They were both capable men who continued their father's policies, suppressing revolts in Bavaria and Aquitaine, and supporting the great Anglo-Saxon missionary Boniface in his efforts to reform the Frankish church. For the first 2 years of their rule, they didn't even bother with a king. The Merovingian throne simply sat empty, a silent testament to its own irrelevance. But in 743, facing a major rebellion, they realized the old dynasty still had some magic left. They plucked a final obscure Merovingian named Childeric III from a monastery, placed him on the throne, and used his symbolic authority to help legitimize their own. They could conjure up a king when they needed one and ignore him when they didn't. The ultimate power lay with the two brothers. Then, in 747, something remarkable happened. Carloman, the elder brother, who held the richer eastern part of the kingdom, voluntarily gave it all up. In what might be the most extreme case of quiet quitting in history, he renounced his titles, his wealth, and his immense power, and traveled to Italy to become a monk. Historians can only speculate about his motives. Was it a crisis of conscience, a wave of profound piety? Or did his younger brother Pippin give him a gentle but firm nudge towards the monastic life? Whatever the reason, Carloman's shocking retirement left his brother Pippin, known to history as Pippin the Short, though by all accounts he was of average height, as the sole, undisputed ruler of the Franks. Pippin now possessed the entirety of his father's power, yet he was still just the mayor of the palace. The situation had reached a point of constitutional absurdity. One man, Childeric III, had the title of king but held no power, while Pippin had all the power but lacked the title. It was time to end the fiction. Pippin, a shrewd and calculating ruler, knew that simply deposing Childeric and declaring himself king by force, as his ancestor Grimoald had tried to do, was still too risky. He needed a higher authority to sanction the move, an authority so great that no Frankish noble would dare to question it. He found it in the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. Pippin dispatched a formal embassy to Pope Zachary with a cleverly worded hypothetical question. Regarding the kings of the Franks who no longer possess any royal power, the envoys asked, "Is this state of things proper?" It was a leading question, and the Pope knew exactly what was being asked of him. He also knew that he was in desperate need of a powerful friend. The papacy in Rome was being squeezed by the Lombards, a Germanic people who had conquered most of Italy and were now threatening Rome itself. The Pope's traditional protector, the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, was a world away, unable and unwilling to send military aid. The Franks, on the other hand, were the most formidable military power in the West. When the Pippin asked his question, the Pope saw his answer. With the full weight of his apostolic authority, Zachary replied that it was better and more fitting that he who had the power in the kingdom should be called king, rather than he who was falsely so called. That was all the justification Pippin needed. In November of 751, at a great assembly of the Frankish nobility in Soissons, Childeric III was formally deposed. There was no execution, no grand drama. The end of the Merovingian dynasty was a quiet, almost pathetic affair. The symbol of their royal power, their long hair, was ceremonially cut off, and the last long-haired king was sent back to a monastery, where he died a few years later, a forgotten footnote. Pippin was then raised on a shield by the Frankish nobles in the traditional Germanic rite of electing a king, but he added a new and revolutionary ceremony. He was anointed with holy oil by Bishop Boniface, a sacred rite modeled on the anointing of the kings of Israel in the Old Testament. This act transformed the nature of Frankish kingship. Pippin was not just a king by election of the people. He was now king by the grace of God, a divinely sanctioned ruler. A few years later, the alliance was sealed in person. The new pope, Stephen II, undertook the dangerous journey across the Alps into Francia, the first time a reigning pope had ever done so, to plead for help against the Lombards. In a magnificent ceremony, the pope himself re-anointed Pippin and also consecrated his two young sons, Charles and Carloman, marking them as the legitimate successors. In return for this ultimate papal blessing, Pippin fulfilled his end of the bargain. He led his army into Italy twice, defeated the Lombard king, and seized a large swath of territory in central Italy. But instead of keeping this land for himself, Pippin gave it to the Pope. This grant, known as the Donation of Pippin, carved out the territories that would become the Papal States, a sovereign entity ruled by the popes that would last for more than 1100 years. The mayor of the palace had become a divinely appointed king, and the Pope had become a territorial prince. A new power structure was in place in Western Europe, an intimate and world-changing partnership between the Frankish crown and the Roman Church. When Pippin the Short died in 768, he passed on this new, holy kingship to his sons, one of whom was destined to raise that crown to an even greater height. When Pippin the Short died in 768, he followed Frankish custom and divided his newly sanctified kingdom between his two sons. The elder, Charles, and the younger, Carloman, were co-rulers, but their relationship was poisoned by jealousy and suspicion from the very beginning. For 3 years, they engaged in a cold war of political maneuvering, each refusing to aid the other in putting down rebellions within their own territories. It seemed the Carolingian dynasty was destined to repeat the same self-destructive cycle of fraternal strife that had torn apart the Merovingians. But in 771, fate, or perhaps something more deliberate, intervened. Carloman died suddenly, the official cause being a severe nosebleed. The timing was, to say the least, remarkably convenient for his brother. Charles, wasting no time on mourning, moved with lightning speed. He marched his army into Carloman's territories, brushed aside the claims of his two infant nephews, and declared himself the sole king of all the Franks. Carloman's terrified widow gathered her children and fled to the one place she thought she might find protection, the court of the Lombard king in Italy. With this single, ruthless act, Charles had reunified his father's kingdom and was now its undisputed master. This new king was a man of boundless energy and imposing presence. By the standards of his time, he was a giant, standing over 6 feet tall, with a thick neck and a piercing gaze. He was restless, intelligent, and insatiably curious, a man who loved to hunt, to swim, and to fight. He was also a man of deep, if sometimes contradictory, piety. He attended Mass daily and was devoted to the teachings of the Church. Yet he could order acts of shocking brutality in the name of that same faith. He was a king who ruled from the saddle, perpetually moving his court and his army across the vast expanse of his territories. For the nearly half a century of his reign, there would be scarcely a single year of peace. His first major campaign as sole ruler took him across the Alps into Italy. Desiderius, the Lombard king who had sheltered Carloman's family, was making aggressive moves against the papacy. Pope Hadrian sent an urgent appeal to Charles, calling on the new Frankish king to honor the alliance his father had made. In 773, Charles led his army through the Alpine passes, catching the Lombards completely by surprise. He cornered their main army and their king in the capital city of Pavia and settled in for a long siege. When the city finally fell the following year, Charles did something novel. Instead of merely deposing Desiderius and installing a puppet, he took the Lombard crown for himself, declaring himself king of the Franks and the Lombards. He had conquered and absorbed an entire kingdom, solidifying his control over Italy and confirming his role as the ultimate protector of the Roman Church. This victory, as impressive as it was, paled in comparison to the conflict that would define his reign, the Saxon Wars. This was not a single war, but a brutal, grinding 32-year struggle against the pagan Saxon tribes who inhabited the dense forests and marshlands of modern-day northern Germany. For Charles, this was more than a war of conquest. It was a holy mission. To subdue the Saxons was to convert them, to bring them into the fold of the Christian Frankish world, whether they wanted to come or not. The war was a grim cycle of Frankish invasion in the summer, followed by Saxon rebellion in the winter. In an early campaign, Charles's troops marched to a sacred Saxon site and destroyed the Irminsul, a great wooden pillar that was central to their pagan worship, an act of profound sacrilege designed to prove the powerlessness of their gods. The Saxons, led by the resilient guerrilla leader Widukind, refused to submit. They would ambush Frankish garrisons, burn down churches, and murder priests. Charles's response was one of terrifying force. After a Frankish army was annihilated in 782, Charles retaliated with an act of calculated terror that has stained his legacy ever since. At Verdun, on the banks of the Arla River, he is said to have ordered the beheading of 4,500 Saxon prisoners in a single day. Historians still argue about the details of this event, with some questioning the number executed or even the account itself. But it speaks to the extraordinary brutality of Charles's methods. His campaign to spread the gospel was, to put it mildly, unusually persuasive. The war only ended in 804 after decades of bloodshed, forced baptisms, and the mass deportation of Saxon families to other parts of the kingdom. Saxony was broken, Christianized by the sword, and absorbed into the Frankish realm. While the Saxon wars were his main preoccupation, they were far from his only ones. He pushed into Spain, establishing a buffer zone south of the Pyrenees, a campaign immortalized by the heroic, if disastrous, ambush of his rearguard at the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass. He formally annexed the semi-independent Duchy of Bavaria, and in the east, he launched a devastating campaign against the Avars, a nomadic people in modern-day Hungary, who had amassed a legendary treasure. From a century of raiding, the Franks shattered the Avar kingdom and captured their great fortified camp, the Ring, seizing a hoard of gold and silver so vast that it fundamentally altered the economy of his entire kingdom. By the close of the 8th century, Charles had doubled the territory he had inherited. He was the master of a realm that stretched from the North Sea to central Italy, and from the Atlantic to the plains of Pannonia. He was, by far, the most powerful ruler in Europe, a new warrior king for a new, expansive Christian society. His Frankish kingdom was beginning to look very much like a new empire. By the year 800, Charles was the master of a Christian kingdom that rivaled the old Roman Empire in size. He commanded a powerful army, dispensed justice, and was the sworn protector of the Church. In Constantinople, the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, Empire continued its ancient traditions, but its power in the West had all but vanished. To make matters more complicated, the imperial throne there was occupied by the Empress Irene, who had seized power by having her own son blinded and deposed. In the legalistic and patriarchal minds of many Western scholars and churchmen, this meant the imperial throne of the Romans was not just held by a woman, but was effectively vacant. The world, it seemed, was holding its breath, waiting for a true, powerful male emperor to emerge. The catalyst for the dramatic event to come, however, was not a grand strategic plan, but a vicious outbreak of street violence in Rome. The reigning Pope, Leo III, was not popular with the powerful aristocratic families of the city. They saw him as a low-born upstart and spread rumors about his personal conduct. In the spring of 799, as the Pope was riding in a religious procession, he was ambushed by a gang of armed conspirators. They pulled him from his horse, beat him severely, and, in an act of symbolic mutilation, attempted to gouge out his eyes and tear out his tongue. The Roman aristocracy's approach to human resources was, shall we say, a bit aggressive. Miraculously, Leo was not permanently blinded and managed to escape his captors. He fled the city and made the arduous journey over the Alps to seek refuge with the one man who could save him, Charles, King of the Franks, whom he met at his court in Paderborn, deep in recently conquered Saxony. This was a crisis of the highest order. The Vicar of Christ had been assaulted and effectively deposed by a local gang of thugs. Charles, as the official patrician of the Romans, had a sworn duty to protect the papacy. He received Leo with all the honor due his station, and in the autumn of 800, he personally escorted the Pope back to Rome at the head of a great army. He convened an assembly of bishops and nobles, at which Leo was able to publicly swear an oath of innocence, purging himself of the charges his enemies had leveled against him. Charles had restored order and saved the Pope. His authority was now absolute, not just in his own kingdom, but in the eternal city itself. It was in this supercharged atmosphere that the idea of an imperial coronation was born. Historians have debated for centuries who was the true author of this momentous event. Was it the culmination of a long-held ambition of Charles himself, who saw the title as the logical capstone to his conquests? Was it the idea of the sophisticated scholars at his court, men like the Englishman Alcuin, who were already referring to his kingdom as an empire in their letters? Or was it an audacious and brilliant improvisation by Pope Leo, a way for a weak and embattled pope to reassert his own authority and bind the most powerful man on earth irrevocably to the destiny of Rome? Whatever its origin, the plan came to fruition on Christmas Day, in the year 800. Charles, his family, and his Frankish nobles attended the Christmas Mass at the ancient Basilica of St. Peter. The vast church was filled with the Roman populace and clergy. According to his biographer Einhard, the king was kneeling before the altar in prayer. As he rose, Pope Leo stepped forward, raised a golden crown high, and placed it firmly on the Frankish king's head. At that prearranged signal, the entire congregation, who had likely been well rehearsed for the moment, chanted the ancient imperial acclamation: "To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, the great and peace-giving emperor of the Romans, life and victory." In that moment, after a gap of 324 years, a Roman emperor once again reigned in the West. Einhard famously claims that Charles was utterly surprised by the coronation and deeply annoyed, stating that had he known of the Pope's plan, he would never have set foot in the church that day. It's a fascinating claim. Was the most powerful and calculating man in Europe truly caught off guard by such a public spectacle? Or was this a masterful display of political theater, a feigned humility to show that he had not sought this supreme honor, but had it thrust upon him by God and the Roman people? We will never know for sure, but the consequences of that act were immediate and profound. It created a new political geography, establishing a Western European empire as a rival to the one in the East. And, most critically, for the centuries to come, the ceremony established a powerful precedent. It was the Pope who had physically placed the crown on the emperor's head. The act implied that imperial authority flowed from God through the hands of his vicar. The Pope, a Frankish king, had revived the Roman Empire, but he had done so in a way that gave the Church an authority over it that would become the source of a titanic struggle for the soul of Europe. Charles left Rome no longer just a king, but as the first Holy Roman Emperor, Charlemagne, Charles the Great. Returning from Rome with the magnificent new title of Emperor, Charles, or Charlemagne, as he would now be known, faced a daunting task. He ruled a vast empire forged by the sword, but an empire of the sword is held together only by the strength of the man who wields it. To create something that would last, something worthy of the Roman name, he needed to give it a common culture, a functioning administration, and a unified faith. The problem was that his empire was a patchwork of different peoples, languages, and customs, and the cultural and intellectual life of Western Europe was in a dismal state. Generations of chaos had taken their toll. The Latin used by priests and scribes had become so corrupted and varied from region to region that a cleric from Spain could barely understand a document from Italy. Many priests were functionally illiterate, mumbling their way through a mass they could not properly read, let alone understand. For Charlemagne, a deeply practical and pious man, this was a crisis. A Christian empire required a clergy that could accurately read the Word of God, and an administrative class that could write and understand clear, precise laws. It was time for a continent-wide, imperial, back-to-school program. The heart of this ambitious project was his new, permanent capital at Aachen in modern-day Germany. He was determined to build it into a second Rome, a political and cultural center for his new empire. The jewel of Aachen was the Palatine Chapel, a stunning octagonal church whose design was directly inspired by the great Byzantine churches of Ravenna. Its soaring arches, gleaming mosaics, and imported marble columns were a clear statement. This was the capital of a new and powerful Roman Empire. From this center, Charlemagne began a massive recruitment effort, using his immense prestige and wealth to attract the best and brightest minds from all over Europe. He brought in grammarians from Italy, like Peter of Pisa, and the Visigothic scholar-poet Theodulf of Orleans. But his greatest intellectual prize was a man he met in Parma, an Anglo-Saxon monk and scholar from York named Alcuin. Alcuin became the architect and driving force of the Carolingian Renaissance, the emperor's chief advisor on all things educational, religious, and cultural. Under Alcuin's guidance, Charlemagne's court was transformed into a vibrant academy. A palace school was established to educate the emperor's own children and the sons of the Frankish nobility, creating a new generation of literate leaders. More importantly, Charlemagne issued decrees ordering that schools be established at every monastery and cathedral in his empire. The curriculum was based on the classical Roman model of the seven liberal arts, intended to create a standardized education for the clergy, ensuring they could read the Bible, understand the writings of the Church Fathers, and calculate the correct date for Easter. But teaching people to read is useless if the books themselves are an illegible mess. The texts available were filled with scribal errors accumulated over centuries of sloppy copying, and they were often written in cramped, impenetrable scripts with no punctuation or even spaces between the words. Here, the scholars at Charlemagne's court made their most enduring contribution. They worked to create a standardized, purified form of Latin that could once again be the universal language of government and the church. And to write this new, clear Latin, they developed a revolutionary new script, the Carolingian minuscule. For the first time, a script was developed that used both upper and lowercase letters, clear and separated forms for each character, and consistent spacing between words. It was a stunning leap forward in information technology, a user interface upgrade for the written word that made reading and writing vastly faster and easier. This script was so clear and beautiful that when the Italian humanists of the 15th century rediscovered it, they mistook it for an original Roman script and based their own new fonts on it. It is the direct ancestor of the Roman type fonts we still use every day. Armed with this new tool, a massive effort began in monastic writing rooms, scriptoria, across the empire. Monks were put to work creating new, corrected master copies of the Bible and other essential Christian texts. But they didn't stop there. They also copied the works of the great pagan authors of ancient Rome: Virgil, Ovid, Cicero, Suetonius. It is a staggering historical fact that around 90% of all surviving classical Roman literature exists today only because it was painstakingly copied by these Carolingian monks. Without their work, our knowledge of the Roman world would be a shadow of what it is. It was an intellectual rescue mission on a civilizational scale. This rebirth of learning was mirrored in the arts, as painters and sculptors turned to classical and Byzantine models to create an imperial art style for their new emperor. Charlemagne, the warrior, had succeeded in forging a new cultural and intellectual unity for his empire. The question now was whether this vast and complex machine, held together by the force of his singular personality, could survive without him. Charlemagne, the Frankish king, had always intended to follow Frankish tradition. His plan, formalized in 806, was to divide his great empire between his three legitimate sons, Charles the Younger, Pippin, and Louis. But the fates, it seemed, had a different plan for the empire's unity. In a strange turn of events that provided a rather extreme solution to the perennial problem of inheritance, both Charles the Younger and Pippin died before their father, and so, when the great emperor himself died in 814, there was only one legitimate heir left standing: the entire, undivided Carolingian Empire, a realm stretching from the marshes of Denmark to the beaches of Barcelona, passed into the hands of his sole surviving son, Louis. This new emperor, known to history as Louis the Pious, was a very different man from his formidable father. Where Charlemagne was a restless warrior king, pragmatic and often brutal, Louis was a quiet, scholarly, and intensely religious man. He was, in many ways, the perfect product of his father's own cultural renaissance. Well-read in theology, fluent in Latin, and more comfortable in a chapel than on a battlefield. Upon taking the throne, his first acts were to institute a moral cleansing of the imperial court at Aachen. He dismissed his father's old worldly advisors, sold off much of the palace treasure to give to the poor, and, in a move that likely caused some family tension, forced his own high-spirited sisters into nunneries to remove their supposedly corrupting influence. He was a man who took the idea of a Christian empire with the utmost seriousness. His greatest ambition was to solve the problem that had plagued the Franks for centuries and make the empire a truly permanent, unified Christian state. In 817, Louis issued a revolutionary decree known as the Ordinatio Imperii, the ordering of the empire. Deeply influenced by the Roman ideal of an indivisible state, this plan sought to override Frankish tradition. It stipulated that upon his death, his eldest son, Lothair, would inherit the imperial title and rule over the vast majority of the empire. The two younger sons, Pippin of Aquitaine and a boy also named Louis, who would become known as Louis the German, would receive small subordinate kingdoms, but would be required to answer to their older brother, the emperor. It was a bold attempt to preserve the unity that fate had handed him. The plan, however, was too radical for its time and began to unravel almost immediately. The first challenge came from his nephew, Bernard, the King of Italy, who saw the Ordinatio as a threat to his own autonomy and rose in rebellion. Louis swiftly crushed the revolt, and his men captured Bernard and had him blinded as punishment, a common Byzantine method for disqualifying a rival. The procedure was botched, and Bernard died an agonizing death 2 days later. Louis was consumed with guilt over the death of his kinsman. In 822, in a stunning and unprecedented act, he performed public penance, confessing his sins before an assembly of bishops and nobles. Historians still debate whether this was a fatal display of weakness that undermined the imperial mystique, or a brave attempt to introduce a new, ethical model of Christian kingship. In either case, it showed his magnates that the emperor's authority was not absolute and could be challenged. The true crisis, however, began with a shift in Louis's family life. After his first wife died, he remarried a beautiful and highly ambitious Bavarian noblewoman named Judith. In 823, she gave birth to a son, Charles, who would later be known as Charles the Bald. The carefully balanced succession plan was now thrown into chaos. Judith began to relentlessly pressure her husband to scrap the Ordinatio and carve out a kingdom for her own son, which could only be done at the expense of her 3 adult stepsons. The addition of a new heir to the family inheritance plan sparked a bit more than the usual amount of drama. The 3 older brothers, Lothair, Pippin, and Louis the German, seeing their own portions threatened, put aside their own rivalries and united in open rebellion against their father. The last decade of Louis's reign was a heartbreaking spectacle of civil war. The sons repeatedly raised armies against their father, who was forced to fight his own children for control of the empire. The lowest point came in 833, at a place later remembered as the Lugenfeld, the Field of Lies. Louis marched with his army to meet his rebellious sons, but he had misjudged the loyalty of his own followers. The sons, particularly the eldest, Lothair, had spent months bribing the great nobles with promises of land and titles. Overnight, the emperor's army melted away as his vassals deserted him to join his children. Louis was forced to surrender. He was publicly humiliated, formally deposed, and compelled to read a long and fabricated list of crimes before a church synod, after which he was confined to a monastery. He was later restored to the throne when the brothers inevitably began to squabble among themselves. But his imperial authority was shattered beyond repair. He spent the rest of his life as a diminished figure, constantly trying to draw and redraw the map of Europe to appease his warring sons. Louis the Pious died in 840, a broken and disappointed man. His grand vision of a united Christian empire perishing with him. With the father now gone, the last restraints on the son's ambitions were gone too, and the civil war for their grandfather's empire was about to begin in earnest. With the death of Louis the Pious, the simmering civil war among his sons boiled over into a final catastrophic conflict. The eldest, Lothair, immediately laid claim to the entire empire and the imperial title, just as his father's first succession plan, the Ordinatio Imperii, had intended. He saw his younger brothers not as fellow kings, but as subordinate vassals. His two surviving brothers, however, Louis the German and the young Charles the Bald, had no intention of submitting. They had spent years fighting their father for their own independent kingdoms, and they were not about to bow to their arrogant older brother. They formed a military alliance, pooled their forces, and prepared for a showdown that would decide the fate of their grandfather's legacy. The armies met near Fontenoy, in Burgundy, on the 25th of June, 841. The battle that followed was no mere skirmish. It was arguably the largest and most destructive battle of the entire Carolingian period, a fratricidal nightmare that pitted Frank against Frank. Charlemagne's grandsons threw the entire military might of the empire at each other in what has to be the most brutal family argument in European history. The fighting was savage, and the losses were immense. A contemporary chronicler, watching the battle, lamented that the fields were so soaked with blood that the mills of the nearby creek were stopped by the gore. By the end of the day, Lothair's army was broken, and he was forced to flee. But it was a Pyrrhic victory for the younger brothers. The Frankish aristocracy, the warrior class that formed the backbone of the empire's military and administration, had been so decimated at Fontenoy that the kingdom was left dangerously exposed, a fact that opportunistic raiders on its borders would soon notice. The battle had proven one thing conclusively: Charlemagne's empire could no longer be ruled by a single man. To solidify their pact and demonstrate their unbreakable resolve, Louis and Charles met the following year, in 842, near the city of Strasbourg. There, in front of their assembled armies, they swore solemn public oaths to support each other against Lothair. What made this event legendary was not the oath itself, but the languages in which it was sworn. Charles the Bald, whose followers were from the western, Latin-influenced part of the empire, swore his oath, not in formal Latin, but in the local vernacular, the lingua romana, or Old French, so that Louis's soldiers could understand him. Louis the German then swore his oath in his own native tongue, the lingua Teudiska, or Old High German, for the benefit of Charles's men. This is the first time these emerging languages, the precursors to modern French and German, were ever written down. The oaths of Strasbourg are the symbolic birth certificate of two of Europe's major cultures, a stark admission that the once unified Frankish realm had irrevocably split into two distinct linguistic and cultural zones. Lothair, defeated in battle and now facing an unbreakable alliance was finally forced to the negotiating table. After months of complex deliberation by a commission of magnates who painstakingly surveyed the empire's resources, the three brothers met in the city of Verdun in August of 843 and agreed to a formal and permanent division of their inheritance. This Treaty of Verdun shattered the Carolingian Empire for good. Charles the Bald received the Kingdom of West Francia, a territory that comprised most of modern-day France. Louis the German became King of East Francia, the lands that would one day form the core of Germany. Lothair, as the eldest, was allowed to keep the prestigious imperial title, but his actual kingdom was a geographical absurdity. He was given a long, narrow, and impossibly vulnerable strip of land that ran down the middle of the old empire, from the coast of the Netherlands, down through the rich Rhine Valley, across the Alps, and into northern Italy. This Middle Kingdom, later known as Lotharingia, contained the two imperial capitals of Aachen and Rome, but it had no ethnic or linguistic unity and no defensible borders. It was a masterpiece of political gerrymandering, designed to give the emperor the prize jewels of the realm, while being utterly impossible to govern or defend. It was a kingdom destined to be fought over and dismembered by its more powerful neighbors to the east and west. Indeed, the thousand-year struggle for control of the lands of that Middle Kingdom, Alsace, Lorraine, Burgundy, the Low Countries, would become one of the most persistent and bloody themes in all of European history. The dream of a unified Christian Roman Empire, forged by Charlemagne's sword, was officially dead. The three kingdoms of his grandsons were now on their own, facing a dark and uncertain future. The Treaty of Verdun had not created peace. It had merely formalized the battle lines. The three kingdoms of Charlemagne's grandsons were weak, suspicious of one another, and exhausted by decades of civil war. Their shattered and demoralized military was in no shape to defend its extensive borders, a fact that did not go unnoticed by the hungry peoples living just beyond them. The late 9th and early 10th centuries became an age of terror, a time when the fractured Carolingian world was assailed from three directions at once, in a storm of violence and plunder. From the north came the Norsemen, or Vikings, in their magnificent longships, shallow-drafted vessels that were equally at home on the storm-tossed Atlantic and the placid rivers of Gaul. They could strike with terrifying speed and impunity. At first, they were coastal raiders, sacking monasteries for their gold and silver before vanishing back into the sea. But their ambitions grew with their successes. They began to sail deep inland along the Seine, the Loire, and the Rhine, sacking cities as far from the sea as Paris and Cologne. They started to stay for the winter, building fortified camps from which to launch new raids in the spring. The Carolingian kings proved almost completely helpless against them. Their armies were too slow to assemble, and by the time they arrived at a raided town, the Vikings were long gone. The kings often resorted to a policy of appeasement, paying vast sums of silver, known as Danegeld, to bribe the raiders to leave. This was, of course, a terrible subscription service that only guaranteed the Vikings would be back the next year, demanding an even higher price. From the south came the Saracens. These were not the armies of a unified caliphate, but disparate groups of Muslim pirates and adventurers based in North Africa. Sicily, and southern Italy. They terrorized the Mediterranean coastline, preying on Christian shipping, raiding coastal towns for slaves and plunder, and even establishing fortified bases in southern Francia. In 846, one Saracen raiding party sailed up the Tiber River and sacked the venerable basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul, which at the time lay outside the main walls of Rome, desecrating the very heart of Western Christendom. And from the east came a new and terrifying enemy, the Magyars, a nomadic people from the Eurasian steppe. They were master horsemen and archers, much like the Huns of centuries before. After settling in the plains of modern-day Hungary, they began to launch a series of devastating long-range raids. Their fast-moving armies of horse archers could cover astonishing distances, appearing as if from nowhere to burn villages and defeat Frankish armies before disappearing back east with their loot and captives. They struck deep into Bavaria, Saxony, and across the Rhine into Francia, and even rode south over the Alps to terrorize northern Italy. Faced with this three-pronged assault, the central authority of the Carolingian kings completely collapsed. Unable to provide basic security for their people, their legitimacy evaporated. In this terrifying power vacuum, people turned for protection not to a distant, ineffective king, but to the only authority that mattered, the local strongman. Power became decentralized and privatized. Local counts, dukes, and even ambitious castellans who could muster a small force of mounted warriors to fight off a raiding party became the real rulers of their districts. They built castles, at first simple wooden towers on earthen mounds, the classic motte and bailey, where the local peasantry could take refuge when the warning horns blew. This new reality is what we often call feudalism, though historians fiercely debate the term and whether it was ever a coherent system at all. It was, in essence, a world where a warrior's primary loyalty was not to a state or a king, but to the local lord who gave him land and, in return, promised to protect his family. This process was especially pronounced in East Francia, the future kingdom of Germany. As the last Carolingian kings, there faded into weakness and irrelevance. The old tribal identities that Charlemagne had tried so hard to suppress resurfaced. The kingdom began to resolve into a collection of great stem duchies: Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, and Franconia. Powerful local dukes rose to prominence, leading the defense of their own people against the Magyar and Slavic threats on the frontiers. These dukes, not the king, commanded the armies, held the courts, and collected the revenues. They were the true masters of their lands. The Carolingian dream of a universal, centralized Christian empire was dead. It had been replaced by a patchwork of localized powers, a world of castles and armored knights, where survival depended not on an emperor, but on your nearest lord. When the last legitimate Carolingian king in the East, Louis the Child, died in 911 without an heir, the great dukes were left to face the chaos alone. The crown was empty, and it was up to them to find a man strong enough to wear it. When Louis the Child, the last of Charlemagne's legitimate male line descendants in East Francia, died in 911, the great stem dukes were faced with a choice. They could allow the kingdom to dissolve completely into its constituent parts, or they could try to hold it together by electing one of their own to be king. They chose unity, electing Duke Conrad of Franconia. But Conrad's reign was a failure, spent in fruitless conflict with the other powerful dukes. On his deathbed, however, Conrad did something remarkable, a rare case of a politician selflessly putting the good of the realm before family pride. He instructed his brother to take the royal insignia not to their own kin, but to his most powerful and dangerous rival, Henry, the formidable Duke of Saxony. The Franconians and Saxons were the two most powerful tribes, and Conrad knew that only a Saxon king could command the respect needed to save the kingdom. Henry of Saxony, known as Henry the Fowler, because he was supposedly out fixing his birding nets when the news of his election arrived, was the founder of a new Saxon dynasty. He was a stern, practical, and deeply realistic ruler. He understood that he could not simply command the other powerful dukes of Bavaria, Swabia, and Lorraine as Charlemagne had done. Instead, he ruled as a primus inter pares, a first among equals, forging pacts and alliances, respecting the duke's autonomy within their own lands in exchange for their recognition of him as king and commander of the realm's armies. His primary focus was survival. To combat the relentless Magyar raids, he built a network of fortified settlements, or Bergen, across his lands and reformed the army, levying a force of elite, armored heavy cavalry. In 933, his new army met the Magyars at the Battle of Riade, and for the first time won a decisive victory, shattering their aura of invincibility. Henry had stabilized the kingdom and laid the foundation for its recovery. When Henry died in 936, he was succeeded by his son, Otto, a man who shared his father's determination, but none of his modesty. Otto, I did not want to be a first among equals. He intended to be an absolute master. He signaled his ambition by holding his coronation, not in Saxony, but in Charlemagne's old imperial chapel at Aachen, the symbolic heart of the Carolingian Empire. His early reign was a long and bitter struggle to make that symbolic claim a reality. He faced a series of revolts, not just from the other dukes, but from his own family, his half-brother, his younger brother, his own son, and his son-in-law, all at various times rose in rebellion against him, often in alliance with the great dukes. Otto's family reunions must have been fantastically awkward. One by one, he crushed them all, stripping them of their titles and installing his own loyal relatives in their place. To further consolidate his power, he perfected what historians call the Ottonian system. He granted vast lands and powers of governance to the bishops and abbots of the kingdom. Unlike the hereditary dukes, who sought to build their own family power bases, these churchmen were celibate and owed their positions entirely to the king. They became his most reliable and powerful administrators, a loyal counterbalance to the fractious secular nobility. Having secured his kingdom from within, Otto was ready to face the great external threat that still loomed. In 955, the Magyars, hoping to take advantage of another of Otto's family rebellions, launched their largest invasion yet. A massive army poured into Bavaria and laid siege to Augsburg. This was an existential crisis for the German kingdom, and Otto rose to the occasion. He gathered an army composed of contingents from all the great duchies: Bavarians, Swabians, Franconians, and his own elite Saxon cavalry. For the first time, the disparate tribes of East Francia were marching as a single, unified German army under the command of one king. The two armies met on the 10th of August, on the Lechfeld, a gravelly plain near Augsburg. The battle was a tactical masterpiece for Otto. When the Magyars used their classic tactic of a feigned retreat to lure away and ambush a portion of his army, Otto did not panic. He sent a detachment to rescue the surrounded troops and held his main line firm. Then he ordered his own force of thousands of armored, lance-wielding heavy cavalry to charge. It was the ultimate clash of military styles. The light horse archers of the steppe against the disciplined, ironclad knights of feudal Europe. The charge of Otto's knights was unstoppable. They smashed into the Magyar lines, shattering their formations and turning the battle into a bloody rout. The victory was total and annihilating. The Magyar leaders were captured and hanged, and their army was relentlessly pursued and cut down. The Battle of Lechfeld was one of the most important battles of the 10th century. It permanently ended the Magyar threat to the west. The survivors would soon settle, convert, and found the Kingdom of Hungary. For Otto, the victory was a personal apotheosis. There on the battlefield, his triumphant soldiers raised their shields and hailed him in the old Roman style as Pater Patriae and Imperator, father of the fatherland and emperor. He had done more than just win a battle. He had saved Christendom. He was the undisputed leader of the German people, a new Charlemagne, and the most powerful ruler in Europe. The imperial crown was now his for the taking. Hailed as emperor on the battlefield of Lechfeld, Otto the Great now possessed the prestige and military power of a new Charlemagne. But to make the title official, to truly revive the Roman Empire in the West, he needed a crown, and that crown could only be bestowed in one place: Rome. As it happened, the political chaos south of the Alps would soon provide him with the perfect excuse to claim his prize. The Kingdom of Italy, the old Lombard realm, was in turmoil. A powerful noble, Berengar of Ivrea, had seized the throne, and to secure his claim, had imprisoned the young widow of the previous king, a princess named Adelaide of Burgundy. In a dramatic tale that became the stuff of legend, Adelaide managed a daring escape from her island prison on Lake Garda, hiding out in the marshes until she could send a desperate appeal for help to the one man in Europe powerful enough to save her: Otto of Saxony. Otto, a widower himself, saw a golden opportunity. In 951, he led his army across the Alps, sweeping aside Berengar's forces. He met with the rescued Adelaide, and in a move that was both romantic and a masterstroke of political strategy, he married her. This was the most effective corporate merger of the 10th century. By marrying the legitimate queen, Otto instantly became the legitimate king of Italy. He now had a personal, legal claim to the peninsula. He was forced to cut his first Italian adventure short to deal with a major rebellion back in Germany, the one led by his own son. But the groundwork had been laid. A decade later, after his authority in Germany had been cemented at the Lechfeld, the call from Italy came again. The new pope, John XIII, was in trouble. He was a young man from the powerful Roman Tusculani family who had had the papacy turned into a hereditary possession. He was, by all accounts, a disastrous spiritual leader, a man whose life was filled with tales of simony, sacrilege, and debauchery in the papal palace. But he was also politically weak, and his territories were being threatened by that same troublemaker, Berengar of Ivrea, who was once again trying to expand his power. In desperation, Pope John sent envoys to Otto, making him the offer of a lifetime. If Otto would come to Italy and save him from Berengar, the Pope would crown him emperor. This was the moment Otto had been waiting for. In 961, he once again marched his formidable army south. The campaign was less a war and more a triumphal procession. He consolidated his rule in northern Italy and then marched on to Rome. On the 2nd of February, 962, in a magnificent ceremony in St. Peter's Basilica, Pope John XIII placed the imperial crown on the head of Otto the Great and on his wife, Adelaide. In that moment, the Western Empire, which had vanished with the collapse of Charlemagne's legacy, was reborn. This event is what historians traditionally mark as the founding of the Holy Roman Empire. It forged a permanent, structural link between the German monarchy and the Roman imperial title. From this day forward, the man elected King of the Germans would have a claim to be King of Italy and Holy Roman Emperor, a destiny that would draw German armies across the Alps for the next 600 years. Otto, however, was no one's pawn. Immediately after the coronation, he had the Pope sign a treaty known as the Privilegium Ottonianum, the Ottonian privilege. On the one hand, it confirmed the Pope's right to the Papal States, but on the other, it unequivocally established the Emperor's authority over the Pope. No new Pope, it stipulated, could be officially consecrated without first swearing a personal oath of loyalty to the Emperor or his representatives. The Emperor was not just the Church's protector, he was its overlord. The ink was barely dry on this agreement when Pope John XIII began to regret his decision. Resenting his new master, he started secret negotiations with Otto's enemies. Otto, hearing of this betrayal, marched back to Rome in a fury. He convened a council of bishops, presented a laundry list of John's shocking crimes, and had the very Pope who had crowned him formally deposed. He then engineered the election of his own hand-picked candidate, a layman from his court, as Pope Leo VIII. The demonstration of power was absolute. Otto had shown that he could not only protect the Pope, but he could fire him. The Ottonian system of a state-controlled church was now projected onto Rome itself. Otto the Great had restored the empire, but in doing so, he had asserted an imperial dominance over the papacy that, while effective for now, created a deep-seated resentment that was destined one day to erupt into open war. The mighty empire forged by Otto the Great was built on a foundation of imperial control over the church. For a century, this system worked remarkably well. Otto's successors, including his son Otto II and his brilliant, mystical grandson Otto III, continued to march into Italy, depose unruly popes, and install their own hand-picked candidates. The peak of this power came under the Salian Emperor Henry III in the mid-11th century. A man of deep piety and unshakable authority, he marched to Rome in 1046 to find three rival popes, all claiming the throne. At the Synod of Sutri, he calmly deposed all three and proceeded to appoint a series of devout, reform-minded German bishops to the papal see. He was cleaning up the church, acting as the rightful head of Christendom. But in doing so, he ironically lit the fuse of a revolution that would shatter his own imperial authority. For decades, A powerful reform movement had been building within the church, radiating out from the great Burgundian monastery of Cluny. The reformers had a clear agenda. They wanted to stamp out simony, the buying and selling of church offices. They wanted to enforce clerical celibacy, to stop church lands from being treated as family property. And above all, they wanted libertas ecclesiae, the liberty of the church. This was a revolutionary idea. It meant that the church should be entirely independent from the control of lay rulers. Kings, dukes, and especially the emperor, they argued, had no right to appoint bishops or abbots. These were spiritual matters, to be decided by the church alone, under the supreme guidance of its head, the Pope. The very German popes Henry III had installed were steeped in this ideology. It was a classic case of a reform movement turning on its own patron. The reformers got their chance when the powerful Henry III died in 1056, leaving his 6-year-old son, the future Henry IV, on the throne. With the empire rudderless under a long regency, the Reform Party in Rome made its move. In 1059, a papal council issued a decree that ripped the heart out of the old Ottonian system. From now on, the Pope would be elected exclusively by the College of Cardinals in Rome. The emperor's role was eliminated. The papacy had declared its independence when the young Henry IV came of age. He found himself on a collision course with a papacy that was no longer a tool of the empire, but its greatest rival. The conflict came to a head when one of the most zealous and brilliant reformers, a man named Hildebrand, was elected pope, taking the name Gregory VII. Gregory possessed an exalted, almost terrifying vision of papal power. He believed the Pope was the supreme sovereign on earth, above all kings and princes, with the God-given authority to judge and even depose them. In 1075, he brought the issue to a head, formally forbidding the practice of lay investiture, the ceremony where a king would invest a new bishop with his ring and pastoral staff, the very symbols of his office. Later, he would issue the Dictatus Papae, a stunning document that boldly stated the Pope alone could depose an emperor. Henry IV, a proud and stubborn ruler, saw this as a direct assault on the foundations of his kingdom. His bishops and abbots were not just spiritual guides. They were his greatest landowners, his most important administrators. To give up the right to choose them was to give up the ability to rule. He defied the Pope, appointing his own man to the powerful Archbishopric of Milan. Gregory's response was swift and devastating. In 1076, he excommunicated Henry IV, declared him deposed as king, and in a move of political genius, absolved all of Henry's subjects from their oaths of loyalty to him. This was a political earthquake. The great dukes of Germany, always eager to increase their own power at the king's expense, used the excommunication as the perfect excuse. They declared that if Henry was not freed from the ban of excommunication within a year, they would elect a new king. Henry's kingdom was dissolving before his eyes. In a desperate, last-ditch gamble to save his crown, he decided on a course of radical, public humiliation. He undertook what would become the most legendary apology tour in history. In the dead of winter, he secretly crossed the treacherous, snow-covered Alps with only a small retinue to find the Pope. Gregory was staying at the mountain fortress of Canossa in northern Italy for 3 days in January of 1077. The Emperor of the Romans, the most powerful secular ruler in Christendom, stood outside the castle gates, barefoot in the snow, dressed as a humble, penitent pilgrim, begging the Pope for forgiveness. Gregory, who would have preferred to see Henry deposed by his dukes, was trapped. As a priest, he could not refuse forgiveness to a sinner who showed such profound penance. He had to lift the excommunication. Henry had saved his throne, but the world had witnessed an unforgettable spectacle. The heir of Charlemagne and Otto the Great had been humbled by the power of the Pope. The balance of power in Europe had been changed forever. The dramatic humbling of the emperor at Canossa did not end the great struggle, but it did change the rules of the game. The conflict over investiture dragged on for another 50 years, ending in a compromise in 1122 that left the emperor's power permanently weakened. The real winners were the great German princes, who used the long civil wars to consolidate their own authority. After the imperial Salian dynasty died out, Germany was plunged into a decades-long feud between its two most powerful families, the Welfs of Bavaria and the Hohenstaufen of Swabia. This rivalry became so bitter that their names echoed down into Italy, where the supporters of the Pope became known as Guelphs, and the supporters of the Emperor were called Ghibellines, a political division that would tear Italian cities apart for centuries. It was into this fractured world that a new, charismatic leader emerged in 1152, a man who seemed destined to end the chaos. He was Frederick, the Hohenstaufen Duke of Swabia. Crucially, his mother was a Welf, so his election as king was seen as an act of reconciliation. This was Frederick the Certain, a man of legendary ambition, chivalry, and a magnificent red beard that earned him the Italian nickname Barbarossa. He was obsessed with the legacy of Charlemagne and Otto the Great, and was utterly convinced of his sacred duty to restore the full rights and powers of the Holy Roman Empire. And he knew exactly where the resources to fund this restoration lay: in the fabulously wealthy cities of northern Italy. Over the last century of imperial distraction, Lombardy had become the most economically vibrant region in Europe. Cities like Milan, Cremona, and Bologna had grown into powerful independent city-states, or communes. They were governed by their own elected consuls, minted their own coins, and grew rich on trade, all while completely ignoring the authority of the distant German emperor. To Barbarossa, these proud citizen republics were nothing more than rebellious subjects illegally withholding his imperial revenues. In a series of major expeditions across the Alps, he set out to bring them to heel. At a great assembly on the Roncadlian plains in 1158, Frederick, backed by scholars of Roman law, laid down the law. He issued a detailed list of his imperial rights, the regalia, which included the right to levy taxes, appoint all officials, and control all roads and rivers. He was, in effect, tearing up their charters of liberty and declaring himself their absolute master. The Lombard cities, led by the fiercely independent Milan, were not about to surrender their freedom. They responded by forming an unprecedented military alliance, the Lombard League. This league, backed financially and spiritually by the Pope, Alexander III, who rightly saw Frederick's ambition in Italy as a mortal threat to the Papal States, became the emperor's greatest nightmare. For years, a brutal war raged across northern Italy. Frederick, in a fit of rage, completely destroyed the city of Milan, sowing its ruins with salt. But the League would not break. The final decisive showdown came on the 29th of May, 1876, near the small town of Legnano. Frederick, at the head of his elite army of German feudal knights, the most feared fighting force in Europe, confronted the citizen militia of the Lombard League. The heart of the Lombard army was gathered around their carroccio, a massive, sacred war wagon drawn by oxen and flying the city's standard. Around it stood an infantry phalanx known as the Company of Death, whose members had sworn an oath to conquer or die. The battle began with a thunderous charge by Frederick's heavy cavalry. They smashed into the Lombard lines, broke their cavalry, and drove them from the field. The German knights then wheeled around and charged the infantry square, protecting the carroccio. But the citizens held. Their wall of spears and shields was a disciplined, unmovable object against which the waves of German chivalry broke in vain. As the emperor's knights became bogged down in the bloody infantry scrum, the Lombard cavalry, which had rallied, suddenly reappeared and crashed into Frederick's exposed flank. In the chaos, Frederick himself was unhorsed and vanished from sight. A rumor flashed through the imperial army. The emperor was dead. Panic set in, and the most formidable army in Christendom broke and fled in a humiliating rout. It was a world-changing victory. An army of merchants, craftsmen, and burghers had defeated the greatest feudal monarch of the age. Frederick, who had survived the battle, was forced to accept the consequences. He made his peace with Pope Alexander, formally recognizing him and abandoning the anti-pope he had supported. And at the Peace of Constance in 1183, he granted the Lombard cities the right to govern themselves, in exchange for a nominal recognition of his imperial overlordship. His grand Italian ambitions lay in ruins. Yet Barbarossa was not finished. In a final, brilliant diplomatic stroke, he arranged for his son and heir, Henry, to marry the Princess Constance, the heiress to the wealthy Norman kingdom of Sicily and southern Italy. He had failed to conquer the north by force, but he had now encircled the papacy from the south by marriage. The old emperor died, as legend demanded, while on the Third Crusade, but he had bequeathed to his heirs an even more intense and dangerous chapter in the long struggle for Italy. Frederick Barbarossa's final gambit, marrying his son Henry VI to Constance, the heiress of Sicily, was a strategic masterstroke that fundamentally altered the political geography of Italy. The Norman Kingdom of Sicily was a unique and dazzlingly wealthy realm, a sophisticated, multicultural society where Norman, Italian, Greek, and Arab traditions blended. It was also, crucially, the papacy's traditional feudal ally and protector. By acquiring it, the Hohenstaufen dynasty had now encircled the Papal States, trapping them in an imperial vice. Henry VI, a man as ambitious as his father, but far colder and more ruthless, spent his short reign brutally consolidating his power in both Germany and his new southern Italian kingdom. When he died suddenly in 1197, he left behind a 3-year-old son, Frederick, as heir to this vast and dangerous inheritance. The papacy, seeing a golden opportunity to break the Hohenstaufen stranglehold, immediately plunged Germany back into a new round of civil war by backing a rival Welf candidate for the imperial throne. The young Frederick, a boy who was king of Sicily, but a contested claimant to the empire, grew up not in the cold forests of Germany, but in the sun-drenched, bustling, and cosmopolitan streets of Palermo. This unique upbringing produced a ruler unlike any seen before in medieval Europe. Frederick II was a man of breathtaking intellect and boundless curiosity. He was a poet, a falconer, a skilled diplomat, a brilliant lawmaker, and a patron of the arts and sciences. He spoke 6 languages, including Arabic, and his court in Sicily was a magnet for Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars. He founded the University of Naples, conducted scientific experiments, and wrote a definitive treatise on ornithology. But he was also an autocratic, iron-willed ruler with a vision of imperial power that was absolute, centralized, and modeled more on the ancient Roman emperors than on his own feudal German ancestors. His contemporaries, bewildered by his modern, secular style of rule and his apparent fascination with Islamic culture, gave him the name by which he is still known. Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. His relationship with the papacy, his official guardian in his youth, was doomed from the start. Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful popes in history, had protected Frederick's claim to the empire on the condition that he would always keep the governments of Germany and Sicily separate, a promise Frederick had no intention of keeping. Later popes, particularly the formidable Gregory IX, saw Frederick's drive to unify Italy under his direct rule as an existential threat. They demanded he fulfill his vow to lead a crusade to the Holy Land, hoping to get him out of Italy. When he delayed due to illness, the Pope excommunicated him, in a move that perfectly captures his unorthodox style. Frederick simply went on crusade anyway, while excommunicated. Instead of fighting, he negotiated. Using his knowledge of Arabic and his diplomatic skill, he struck a deal with the Sultan of Egypt, Al-Kamil, that restored Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to Christian control for 10 years. He had won more through diplomacy than entire crusades had won through war. But because he had done it while excommunicated, and by treating a Muslim sultan as an equal, the papacy was furious. Frederick entered Jerusalem, and since no priest would crown and excommunicate, he simply took the crown of the Kingdom of Jerusalem from the altar and placed it on his own head. Returning to Italy, he found the papacy had sponsored an invasion of his kingdom. He drove the papal forces out and spent the next 2 decades locked in a relentless, all-consuming struggle against the popes and their Guelph allies in the Lombard cities of the north. It was a war of unprecedented bitterness, fought not just with armies, but with propaganda. The Pope denounced Frederick as the Antichrist, a heretical beast from the apocalypse. Frederick's court, in turn, denounced the papacy as a corrupt den of avarice, a perversion of true Christianity. Frederick had some initial successes, winning a major victory over the Lombard League at the Battle of Cotanuova in 1237. But he could never achieve a final, decisive victory. The popes, with their vast spiritual and financial resources, could always find new allies and stir up new rebellions against him. The long war exhausted his Sicilian kingdom's finances and drained Germany of men and resources, as his attention was always focused south of the Alps. The German princes, whom he largely left to their own devices, used his absence to become effectively independent rulers in their own lands, further weakening the foundations of imperial power in its German heartland. Frederick II, the wonder of the world, the brilliant philosopher king, died in 1250. His grand project of creating a unified, centralized Italian kingdom still incomplete. His empire locked in an unwinnable, existential war with the Roman Church. The death of Frederick II, the wonder of the world, did not bring peace. For the papacy, the war had never been against one man, but against his entire dynasty, a family they viciously termed the Viper's Brood. The popes were determined to exterminate every last Hohenstaufen claimant to the imperial and Sicilian thrones. Frederick's son, Conrad IV, struggled to hold his inheritance together, but died of malaria in Italy just 4 years after his father. The Ghibelline cause was then taken up by Frederick's capable illegitimate son, Manfred, who had himself crowned King of Sicily. The papacy, seeing Manfred's success, played its trump card. It declared the Hohenstaufen deposed and offered the crown of Sicily to a foreign prince who would act as the church's champion and vassal. The cold, pious, and ruthlessly ambitious Charles of Anjou, brother of the King of France. With a French army and papal funds, Charles invaded Italy. He defeated and killed Manfred at the Battle of Benevento in 1266, seizing the kingdom for himself. The Hohenstaufen legacy now rested on the shoulders of one last boy, Conradin, the 16-year-old son of Conrad IV. In a final doomed attempt to reclaim his family's patrimony, the young prince led a German army across the Alps in 1268. He was met and defeated by Charles of Anjou's veteran forces. Conradin was captured, handed over to his rival, and in an act that horrified the chivalric sensibilities of Europe, was subjected to a mock trial and publicly beheaded in the main square of Naples. The execution of a legitimate Christian prince, the last scion of the imperial house of Hohenstaufen, was a brutal and definitive statement. The Viper's Brood was extinct, and the papacy had won its long war. But in destroying the imperial family, the papacy had also destroyed the imperial office itself. The death of Conradin marked the effective end of any central authority in the Holy Roman Empire. The period from the death of Frederick II until the year 1273 is known as the Great Interregnum, the time between reigns. For over 2 decades, the empire had no recognized and effective head. The German princes, who held the right of election, did go through the motions. They chose 2 foreigners, Richard of Cornwall, the wealthy brother of the King of England, and Alfonso, the King of Castile in Spain. But this was a cynical exercise in profiteering. Both candidates paid colossal bribes to the German princes for the honor of the imperial title, which was the ultimate example of buying a title for pure prestige. Alfonso never once set foot in Germany, and Richard only visited a handful of times. Neither had any real power or interest in actually governing the empire. This power vacuum was a golden age for the princes. With no emperor to answer to, they became the undisputed sovereigns of their own territories. They waged private wars on each other, set up their own law courts, and collected tolls on rivers and roads, strangling trade. The empire dissolved into a chaotic patchwork of hundreds of independent counties, duchies, bishoprics, and free cities. A general state of lawlessness known as Faustrecht, literally fist law, prevailed. Robber barons perched in their newly built castles overlooking the Rhine, extorting merchants, while feuds between nobles went unchecked by any higher authority. For the princes, this no-boss work environment was a fantastic arrangement that allowed them to cement their own local power. Out of this anarchy, however, one important structural change emerged: the right to elect the German king, and therefore the future emperor, had always been a somewhat fuzzy process. Now, to avoid the bickering of the entire nobility, this right became solidified in the hands of a small, elite group of the seven most powerful German rulers. This college of prince-electors consisted of three archbishops, of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier, and four secular lords: the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, the Margrave of Brandenburg, and the King of Bohemia. This powerful committee would, for the next 500 years, hold the fate of the empire in its hands. Eventually, the chaos of the interregnum became too much even for the princes who had benefited from it. Trade was being destroyed, law and order had vanished, and the need for at least a nominal head of the realm to act as an arbiter and peacekeeper became overwhelming. In 1273, the electors finally decided to choose a new German king. But they had learned their lesson from the powerful and ambitious Hohenstaufen. They deliberately looked for a candidate who was not a mighty duke, but a minor count of relatively modest power. A man they believed would be too weak to ever challenge their own princely rights. Their choice fell upon a Swabian count named Rudolf of the House of Habsburg. In choosing the obscure Count Rudolf of Habsburg to be their king in 1273, the powerful prince-electors thought they were hiring a quiet caretaker, a man with a modest family background who would keep the peace without having the power to diminish their own princely privileges. They had elected a man they believed they could control. It was a classic miscalculation, the political equivalent of hiring a seemingly harmless manager who proceeds to take over the entire company. Rudolf was a shrewd, pragmatic, and deeply ambitious man, but his ambition was of a new and different kind. He had no romantic illusions about restoring the glory of the Hohenstaufen, no grand designs on reconquering Italy or dictating to the Pope. He focused on a new imperial strategy, one that would define the late medieval empire: Hausmachtpolitik, or the house power policy. The goal was no longer to strengthen the empire as a whole, but to use the legal and military powers of the imperial office to acquire as much land and as many titles as possible for one's own family. Rudolf's great opportunity came from a dispute with the powerful and overbearing King Ottokar II of Bohemia, who had taken advantage of the great interregnum to annex the valuable duchies of Austria, Styria, and Carinthia. Rudolf, using his newfound imperial authority, demanded that Ottokar surrender these lands, claiming they were vacant fiefs of the empire. When Ottokar refused, Rudolf declared war in 1278 at the massive battle on the Marchfeld near Vienna. Rudolf's army decisively defeated the Bohemian king, and Ottokar himself was slain on the battlefield. With this single victory, Rudolf transformed the fortunes of his family. He seized the captured duchies and, a few years later, formally invested his own two sons as the new Dukes of Austria and Styria. In one stroke, the House of Habsburg went from being minor Swabian counts to being one of the most powerful dynasties in the empire. They now possessed a rich, consolidated, and strategically vital power base in the southeast of Germany, a territory that would remain the heart of the Habsburg domains for the next 630 years. The Prince Electors, however, took note of this spectacular success. Wary of the Habsburgs' newfound power, they made sure the imperial crown would not become a family heirloom. After Rudolf's death, they deliberately passed over his son and elected a king from another house, Adolf of Nassau. This set the pattern for the next 150 years. The imperial throne became a political hot potato, passed between the great rival houses of Habsburg, Wittelsbach of Bavaria, and Luxembourg of Bohemia. The empire was now definitively an electoral monarchy, and the princes intended to keep it that way. This long period of relatively weak, competing emperors and powerful princes finally received its constitutional foundation in 1356, under the reign of the Luxembourg Emperor Charles IV. Charles was perhaps the most astute politician of his age, a pragmatist who spent most of his time building up his own kingdom of Bohemia. He founded the university in Prague and made the city a glittering European capital. He understood that the old dream of a universal Christian empire was a fantasy. His goal was to stabilize the empire's chaotic political reality, not to revolutionize it. He did this by issuing the single most important constitutional document of the medieval empire, the Golden Bull. This was, in essence, the ultimate rulebook, the official terms and conditions for the empire's exclusive political club. The Golden Bull formally named the 7 prince-electors who held the sole right to choose the king. It established that a simple majority vote was all that was needed for a valid election, putting an end to the endless disputes and rival claims that had plagued previous successions. To ensure the power of the electors would never be diluted, the bull decreed that their territories were indivisible and must be passed down whole to the eldest son. Furthermore, it granted these 7 princes near sovereign rights within their own lands. What was most remarkable about the Golden Bull, however, was what it left out. In its detailed prescription for electing the King of the Romans' future emperor, it made absolutely no mention of the Pope. There was no need for papal confirmation or approval. The election was a purely German affair, decided by German princes on German soil. It was a quiet but definitive declaration of constitutional independence from Rome. The Golden Bull was a profound admission of what the empire had become. Not a universal Roman Empire, but a decentralized confederation of German principalities, led by an elected monarch with limited powers. It provided a stability that would last for centuries. And it was within this new, more predictable framework that the House of Habsburg would eventually master the game of politics, not through war, but through an even more powerful tool. Within the new, stable constitutional framework of the Golden Bull, the House of Habsburg patiently played the long game. After the imperial crown had passed through a few other families, they eventually managed to reclaim it in the 15th century. And from that point on, they would not let it go. They had found a way to make the electoral monarchy a nearly hereditary possession. not through force of arms, but through shrewd diplomacy, immense prestige, and a tool that was far more effective than war. Their guiding principle was immortalized in the famous Habsburg motto, Bella gerent Ali, to Felix Austria Nuber. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. It was the most successful piece of dynastic dating advice in history. The greatest practitioner of this art was Maximilian III's unassuming father, Frederick III. During his long and rather lethargic reign, he secured the single most important marriage in European history. He arranged for his charismatic and energetic son, Maximilian, to marry Mary of Burgundy, the sole heiress to the vast and dazzlingly wealthy Duchy of Burgundy. This wasn't just a duchy, it was a kingdom in all but name, encompassing the prosperous commercial centers of the Low Countries, Flanders, Brabant, and Holland, the heart of early European capitalism. With this one wedding, the Habsburgs instantly became the richest dynasty in Europe, but it also brought them a permanent, intractable enemy, the King of France, who viewed the Duchy of Burgundy as his own rightful territory and would now be locked in a rivalry with the Habsburgs that would shape the map of Europe for the next 300 years. When Maximilian I came to the throne in 1493, he was a figure who seemed to straddle two different ages. On the one hand, he was a man in love with the medieval past, a patron of jousting tournaments and chivalric orders, who styled himself the Last Knight. On the other, he was a forward-thinking Renaissance prince, a master of propaganda who used the new technology of the printing press to celebrate his own exploits, and a ruler who understood that his fragmented, decentralized empire was dangerously obsolete. The world around him was changing. Powerful, centralized, new monarchies were rising in France, Spain, and England, with professional armies and national systems of taxation. To the east, the Ottoman Empire was relentlessly pushing into the Balkans. Maximilian knew that for the Holy Roman Empire to survive, it needed a radical upgrade. This effort to modernize the empire's creaking medieval structure was known as the Imperial Reform, and it reached its climax at a great assembly of the princes, the Imperial Diet, held in the city of Worms in 1495. Here, Maximilian and the princes hammered out a series of landmark reforms. They proclaimed an perpetual public peace, formally outlawing the private feuds and wars between the various princes, counts, and cities that had plagued Germany for centuries. To enforce this peace, they created a new Supreme Court, the Reichskammergericht, where disputes could be settled by law rather than by the sword. These were profound successes that gave the empire a new degree of internal stability. But the centerpiece of the reform package was the most revolutionary and ultimately the most contentious proposal, the common penny, a universal imperial tax to be levied on every single subject of the empire. This tax was meant to provide the emperor, for the first time, with a central treasury and the funds to maintain a standing imperial army. It was a step too far. The hundreds of princes, bishops, and free cities that made up the empire were fiercely protective of their own independence, and their most cherished right was the right to tax their own subjects. the idea of sending that money to a central imperial government was met with widespread resistance and evasion. The common penny, as unpopular as any new tax in history, was a resounding failure. It was eventually abandoned, and with it, the dream of transforming the Holy Roman Empire into a centralized modern state. It would remain a loose confederation, a realm of laws and traditions, but not a unified nation with a common treasury or a single army. While his constitutional reforms met with only partial success, Maximilian's use of the family's signature tool, marriage, was an absolute triumph. Looking to counter the power of France, he engineered an alliance with the newly unified Kingdom of Spain. In a spectacular diplomatic coup, he arranged a double marriage, wedding his son, Philip the Handsome, to Joanna, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Through a series of tragic and unexpected deaths in the Spanish royal family, the son of this union, a boy named Charles, was left as the sole heir to a staggering inheritance. Maximilian, the last knight, had failed to forge a new state, but he had succeeded in forging a new dynasty. He had arranged things so that his grandson was poised to inherit not just Austria and Burgundy, but also Spain, southern Italy, and the vast, silver-rich territories of a new world across the ocean. This immense concentration of power was about to collide head-on with the greatest spiritual crisis Europe had seen in 1,000 years. Maximilian's grand dynastic strategy paid off on a scale that even he could have scarcely imagined. His grandson, Charles, came into an inheritance that was less a kingdom and more a map of the world. It was like winning the lottery 5 times in a row. From his mother, Joanna of Castile, he inherited all of Spain, her Italian possessions of Naples, Sicily, and Sardinia, and Spain's sprawling, silver-rich empire in the Americas. From his father, Philip the Handsome, he inherited the wealthy Burgundian lands of the Netherlands. And from his grandfather, Maximilian, he inherited the Habsburg heartlands of Austria. When Maximilian died in 1519, Charles used vast loans from the Fugger banking family to outbribe his rival, the King of France, and was duly elected Holy Roman Emperor. As Emperor Charles V, he was now the ruler of a global empire on which the sun, quite literally, never set. He was, without question, the most powerful Christian ruler since Charlemagne, and he was a devout, serious-minded Catholic, deeply committed to the idea of a universal, unified Christendom. But just as this new universal emperor ascended the throne, the very foundation of that universal Christendom was cracking apart. In 1517, 2 years before Charles's election, an obscure theology professor at the new university in Wittenberg, Saxony, had taken issue with a papal fundraising campaign. A Dominican friar was aggressively marketing special indulgences, which promised to release souls from purgatory, with the catchy slogan, "As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs." The monk, whose name was Martin Luther, was outraged by what he saw as the commercialization of salvation. He drafted a list of 95 points for academic debate and, according to legend, nailed them to the church door. This protest against one corrupt practice soon exploded into a full-scale theological revolution. Using the power of the printing press to spread his ideas with unprecedented speed, Luther went on to challenge the very authority of the Pope, arguing for salvation by faith alone. the Bible as the only source of truth, and a priesthood of all believers that eliminated the need for a special clerical class. The Luther affair was the most urgent crisis awaiting the new 21-year-old emperor when he arrived in Germany to preside over his first imperial diet in the city of Worms in 1521. Luther, who by now had been excommunicated by the Pope, was summoned to appear before the emperor and the assembled princes of the realm. He was promised safe conduct to come, and it was universally expected to publicly recant his heretical writings. The scene was one of immense drama. The lone, common-born monk standing before the most powerful man in the world, surrounded by the great nobles and churchmen of the empire. He was asked a simple question. Would he recant? The next day, Luther gave his now legendary reply. Speaking first in German, then in Latin, he concluded that unless he could be proven wrong by the words of Scripture or by clear reason, he was bound by his conscience. My conscience is captive to the word of God, he declared. I cannot and will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. Here I stand. I can do no other. God help me. Amen. For Charles V, a man who saw himself as the divinely appointed defender of the Catholic faith, this was an act of breathtaking arrogance and heresy. After Luther departed, the emperor issued the Edict of Worms, declaring Luther an outlaw. Anyone could kill him without penalty. His writings were to be burned, and his teachings suppressed. But the edict was never truly enforced. On his journey home, Luther was kidnapped by soldiers sent by his own prince, Frederick the Wise, the Elector of Saxony. He was hidden away for nearly a year in the secluded Wartburg Castle, where he spent his time translating the New Testament into German. The Reformation survived because it ceased to be a purely theological movement and became a political one. Powerful German princes, like Frederick, gave it their protection. Their motives were mixed. Some were men of sincere faith who were moved by Luther's message. Others, however, saw a golden opportunity. Embracing the new faith meant they could assert their independence from the emperor, stop the flow of church money from their lands to Rome, and, most enticingly, it gave them the perfect excuse to confiscate the vast, wealthy lands of the Catholic Church within their own territories. Their newfound religious piety happened to align perfectly with their political and financial interests. Charles V was unable to crush this princely rebellion in its infancy because his attention was immediately pulled in a dozen other directions. His vast empire was a strategic nightmare, forcing him to fight a multi-front war for his entire reign. His primary obsession was a series of ruinously expensive wars against his great rival, King Francis III of France, for control of Italy. At the same time, he had to face the immense power of the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent, whose armies were advancing up the Danube, conquering Hungary, and even laying siege to the walls of Vienna. For Charles, the schism in Germany was just one of many crises, and one he was continually forced to postpone dealing with. This delay allowed the Protestant Reformation to take deep root, splitting his German lands and the soul of his empire in two. The great conflict between Charles V and his Protestant princes ended not in victory, but in exhaustion. An aging and weary emperor, Charles finally abdicated his thrones, divided his vast empire between his brother and his son and retired to a monastery. The religious question in the Holy Roman Empire was settled in 1535 by the Peace of Augsburg, a treaty that was a landmark of reluctant pragmatism. It was built on a simple, elegant principle: cuius regio, ius religio, or whose realm, his religion. This meant that each of the hundreds of princes within the empire could now legally choose whether his territory would be Lutheran or Catholic. For the first time, Protestantism had a legal footing in the empire. But this peace was a brittle one, a truce, not a true resolution. It had a fatal flaw. It made no provision for Calvinism, a newer and more militant form of Protestantism that was spreading rapidly. The next 60 years were a period of rising tension, a cold war of competing faiths, as Protestant princes formed a defensive evangelical union, and the Catholics responded by creating a Catholic League. The empire was polarizing into two armed and mutually suspicious religious blocs. The spark that finally ignited this tinderbox landed in the Kingdom of Bohemia in 1618. The new king, a Habsburg named Ferdinand, who was also the heir apparent to the imperial throne, was a zealous, Jesuit-educated Catholic, utterly determined to stamp out the Protestantism that was dominant in his new kingdom. When he began to roll back the religious freedoms of the Bohemian nobility, a group of furious Protestant lords marched to the Hradčany castle in Prague to confront his imperial governors. The argument grew heated, voices were raised, and the Protestant lords, in a fit of rage, solved the dispute in a uniquely Bohemian fashion. They dragged the two Catholic governors and their secretary to a window and threw them out. They plummeted some 70 feet into the castle moat below. Miraculously, all three survived. Catholic propagandists immediately proclaimed they had been gently carried to the ground by angels. The Protestants dryly noted that their fall had been cushioned by a large, strategically located pile of dung. This event, the famous defenestration of Prague, was an act of open rebellion, and it tipped the empire into a war that would last for 30 horrifying years. The conflict that followed was one of the most complex and destructive in European history. It began as a local religious revolt, with the Bohemians being swiftly crushed by the emperor's forces. It then escalated as the Protestant King of Denmark intervened, only to be beaten back by the brilliant and enigmatic imperial general, Albrecht von Wallenstein. The tide turned dramatically in 1630, when a new Protestant champion arrived, King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, a military genius. His well-drilled, professional army, equipped with innovative mobile artillery and funded by the French, smashed the imperial forces and swept through Germany. When he was killed in battle, the war might have ended, but it had by now become a continental power struggle. In the final, bloodiest phase, Catholic France, under the coldly pragmatic Cardinal Richelieu, openly entered the war on the side of the Protestants. Richelieu, a prince of the church, had a very flexible view of Catholic solidarity. His primary goal was not to save Protestantism, but to shatter the power of his great rival, the House of Habsburg. The war was no longer about faith. It was about states, borders, and raw political power. What made the 30 Years' War so uniquely devastating was its very nature. The armies were not loyal national forces, but massive, multinational mercenary hordes, often numbering in the tens of thousands. who followed whichever commander could pay them. When the pay inevitably failed, as it often did, these armies simply lived off the land, a practice the Germans called war feeding war. They would systematically plunder a region, taking every scrap of food and every item of value, burning what they could not carry. They made no distinction between friend and foe. A Protestant village could be just as brutally stripped by a Protestant army as by a Catholic one. To the mercenaries, the German peasants was simply a resource to be consumed. This relentless plundering, combined with the constant movement of huge masses of people, created the perfect conditions for famine and disease. The plague returned again and again, sweeping through the traumatized and malnourished population. Society itself broke down. In the worst hit areas, there are horrifying accounts of cannibalism and of wolves roaming through depopulated villages. The human cost was apocalyptic. While figures are hard to verify, some historians estimate that the population of the Holy Roman Empire dropped from around 20 million to as low as 12 million. It was the greatest catastrophe in German history before the 20th century, a collective trauma that would haunt the German memory for generations. After 3 decades of this unimaginable slaughter, every side was bankrupt, exhausted, and desperate for peace at any price. After 30 years of horror, the peoples of the Holy Roman Empire were left with a silence born of pure exhaustion. The great religious and political questions that had sparked the war had been drowned in an ocean of blood, and all that remained was a desperate longing for peace. The negotiations to end the war were almost as long and complex as the conflict itself. For nearly 5 years, diplomats from across Europe gathered in the Westphalian cities of Münster and Osnabrück in a telling sign of the lingering bitterness. The Catholic and Protestant powers refused to even meet in the same city. The French and the Habsburgs negotiated in the Catholic city of Münster, while the Swedes and the German Protestants met in nearby Osnabrück, with envoys riding constantly between the two locations. It was the first great diplomatic congress of the modern age, a grim stocktaking of a continent that had torn itself apart. The resulting set of treaties, known collectively as the Peace of Westphalia, was a masterpiece of pragmatic compromise that would define the political map of Europe for the next century and a half. On the religious front, the peace finally put the ghosts of the Reformation to rest. It reaffirmed the old Peace of Augsburg, but with one crucial addition. The principle of cuius regio, eius religio, was now officially extended to Calvinists, finally acknowledging the religious reality on the ground. To solve the intractable problem of lands and titles seized during the war, the diplomats established a normative year of 1624. Whatever the religious status of a territory was on January the 1st, 1624, that is what it would remain forever. The religious map of Germany was frozen in time, and the age of wars of religion was finally over. But it was the political settlement that was truly revolutionary, and which dealt a final, fatal blow to the power of the Holy Roman Emperor. The treaty formally granted to all the individual states of the empire, the duchies, principalities, bishoprics, and free cities, a right known as Landeshoheit, or territorial sovereignty. This meant that the princes were now recognized as the effective sovereigns within their own borders. They had the right to raise their own armies, collect their own taxes, and most critically, the right to sign treaties and form alliances with foreign powers, so long as those alliances were not directed against the emperor. This single provision shattered the last vestiges of the Habsburg dream of forging a centralized, Catholic, absolutist state in Germany. The emperor's power was now radically curtailed. He could no longer declare war, raise taxes, or pass laws without the consent of the imperial diet, the great assembly of the very princes whose power the treaty had just confirmed. The emperor remained the prestigious, nominal head of the empire, but his office was now largely ceremonial. The princes, in turn, hailed this arrangement as a great victory for the German liberties. Their cherished traditional rights to be masters in their own houses, free from imperial interference. The Holy Roman Empire was no longer a state in any modern sense. It was now a loose, decentralized confederation of about 300 sovereign states, all jealously guarding their independence. The peace also had profound international consequences. France and Sweden, the great victors of the war, were named as official guarantors of the treaty, giving them a permanent legal pretext to intervene in German affairs to protect the rights of the princes. A cynical policy they would use for decades to keep the empire divided and weak. The treaty also formally recognized the full independence of the Swiss Confederation and the Dutch Republic, legally severing them from the empire they had long since left in practice. The Peace of Westphalia is often seen as the dawn of the modern international system, based on the principle of sovereign states, each with the right to be free from outside interference in its own affairs. The medieval dream of a universal Christendom under a single emperor was gone for good. The Holy Roman Empire would limp on for another 150 years, but it was now, as the philosopher Voltaire would later famously quip, neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. The Habsburgs still wore the ancient crown, but it was now a hollow one. Locked in Germany, they would turn their ambitions inward to building their own personal empire in their hereditary lands of Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary. But inside this new, fragmented Germany, another power was beginning its slow, methodical rise. The Holy Roman Empire, after the Peace of Westphalia, was a political fossil, a sprawling collection of sovereign territories united by a shared history and a hollow crown. The Habsburg emperors, their German ambitions thwarted, turned their focus to their own vast dynastic lands in Austria, Hungary, and Bohemia. But in the vacuum of central authority, a new power began its inexorable rise. A state forged not in the rich river valleys of the south, but in the poor, sandy plains of the north. This was Brandenburg Prussia, ruled by the ambitious Hohenzollern dynasty. Their core territory of Brandenburg was so sparsely populated and infertile that it was known dismissively as the sandbox of the Holy Roman Empire. It was not a promising foundation upon which to build a great power. The true architect of this new state was Frederick William, known as the Great Elector, who ruled in the latter half of the 17th century. He had inherited a scattered collection of territories that had been ravaged during the 30 Years' War, and he drew one ironclad conclusion from the devastation. A state without a powerful army is nothing more than a victim. He dedicated his long reign to a single-minded project, the creation of a large, disciplined, and fearsomely efficient standing army. To pay for it, he established a centralized bureaucracy, the General War Commissariat, that ruthlessly collected taxes, overriding the traditional rights of the nobles and towns. He broke the power of the landed aristocracy, the Junkers, but did so in a typically Prussian way. He didn't destroy them, he co-opted them, making them the exclusive officer class of his new army. State service became their new purpose, their loyalty transferred from their local province to the person of the elector. The prestige of the Hohenzollerns grew, and in 1701 they took a major step up. During the War of the Spanish Succession, the Holy Roman Emperor needed military support. The Elector Frederick III offered his powerful Prussian army in exchange for a crown. The Emperor agreed, on the condition that he call himself King in Prussia rather than King of Prussia, since the Duchy of Prussia lay outside the empire's borders, and one could not be a king within the empire itself, except for the King of Bohemia. It was a fine distinction, but the title was what mattered. Brandenburg Prussia was now a kingdom. The new kingdom's identity was hammered into shape by its second king, Frederick William III. He was a strange, brutish, and deeply frugal man who despised the high culture his father had cultivated and was singularly obsessed with one thing: the army. He was known as the Soldier King, and he ran his state like a giant military barracks. He poured every spare thaler into his soldiers, doubling the size of the army until, incredibly, the small state of Prussia had the fourth largest army in all of Europe. He perfected its discipline, drilled it relentlessly, and even developed a system of cantonal recruitment that was a forerunner of modern conscription. His most famous eccentricity was his personal regiment of Potsdam giants, a collection of the tallest men he could find, recruited, bribed, or outright kidnapped from all over Europe. He was the ultimate military hobbyist, a man who built the most perfect army of the age. But he was so obsessively attached to his creation that he could never bring himself to risk it in a real war. He left this fearsome, unused weapon and a full treasury to his son, Frederick II, in 1740. The young Frederick was a complete contrast to his father. He was a sensitive intellectual, a poet and philosopher who played the flute and corresponded with Voltaire. His brutish father had despised him, and no one expected him to be anything more than a cultured patron of the arts. They were profoundly mistaken. In that same year, the Habsburg Emperor Charles VI died, leaving his vast inheritance to his young daughter, Maria Theresa. The great powers of Europe had all signed a treaty agreeing to honor her succession. But Frederick, now king, saw an opportunity too good to pass up. With no justification and no declaration of war, he unleashed his father's perfectly trained army and seized the rich and populous Habsburg province of Silesia. This act of brazen aggression plunged Europe into the War of the Austrian Succession. All of Europe expected the small Prussian upstart to be crushed by the might of Austria and its allies. But Frederick's army, the machine his father had so carefully built, proved its worth, and Frederick himself, the flute-playing poet, revealed himself to be a military genius of the first order. Through 8 years of brutal warfare, and another 7 in a later conflict, he managed to hold on to his prize. The seizure of Silesia was the event that established Prussia as a great European power. It also shattered the old constitution of the Holy Roman Empire. For the first time, there were two rival first-rate military powers within the empire: the old Habsburg monarchy in Vienna and the new Hohenzollern monarchy in Berlin. This German dualism would define the last decades of the empire's existence. The ancient, decaying structure was now cracking from within, even as a new, revolutionary force was gathering in the West that would soon bring the entire edifice crashing down. The uneasy balance of power between Austria and Prussia, this German dualism that defined the late Holy Roman Empire, was a purely internal affair. Both powers, and indeed all the princes of the old order, were utterly unprepared for the political earthquake that was about to erupt in the West. In 1789, the French Revolution began, and with it, a new and terrifyingly powerful idea was unleashed upon the world: that sovereignty lay not with a king or an emperor, but with the nation itself. The crowned heads of the empire, led by the Habsburg emperor in Vienna, looked on in horror as a monarch was overthrown and eventually executed by his own people. They declared war to crush the revolution, but in doing so, they unwittingly helped to unleash the very man who would bring their ancient world to its final end. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, a brilliant, ambitious, and endlessly energetic Corsican general. He rose through the ranks of the revolutionary French army. In a series of dazzling campaigns in Italy in the late 1790s, he repeatedly outmaneuvered and defeated the armies of the Austrian emperor, driving them from the peninsula and shattering the last vestiges of imperial influence there. By 1804, he had crowned himself Emperor of the French, and he saw himself not just as a French sovereign, but as the true successor to Charlemagne and the Roman emperors of old. In his vision for a new, rational, French-dominated Europe, there was no room for the ancient, decaying relic of the Holy Roman Empire. The killing blow came in December of 1805, at the Battle of Austerlitz, in what is widely considered his greatest masterpiece. Napoleon's army brilliantly defeated a larger combined force of Austrian and Russian troops. The Holy Roman Emperor, Francis II, and the Russian Tsar Alexander III watched in person as their armies were torn apart. The defeat was not just a military catastrophe. It was a profound humiliation that broke the will of the old empire. The peace treaty that followed was brutal. Napoleon began to systematically dismantle the thousand-year-old structure. In the summer of 1806, he announced the formation of a new body, the Confederation of the Rhine. 16 of the most important German states, including Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden, were induced to formally secede from the Holy Roman Empire and join this new French-allied confederation, with Napoleon as their official protector. This was the final act. The empire had been hollowed out, its most important members lured away, leaving the Emperor Francis II as the head of a body that no longer truly existed. Napoleon sent him a simple ultimatum: abdicate the imperial throne or face another war with France. Francis, a pragmatic if uninspiring ruler, saw that the game was over. He had already, 2 years earlier, wisely created a new hereditary title for his family, declaring himself Emperor of Austria. He now had a fallback position. On the 6th of August, 1806, Francis II issued a formal proclamation. There was no final battle, no dramatic ceremony, just a legal document, a piece of paper that declared the imperial crown laid down and all states and princes of the former empire absolved of their ancient oaths of allegiance after a lifespan of 1006 years. The Holy Roman Empire, the great medieval dream of a universal Christian state, the direct heir to the legacy of Charlemagne and Otto the Great, was quietly dissolved by the decree of a French emperor. And so our long journey comes to its quiet conclusion. From the misty forests of Roman Gaul, where the first long-haired Frankish chieftains carved out a kingdom from the ruins of a fallen empire, all the way to this final anticlimactic proclamation in Vienna, the story has been one of a single, powerful, and persistent idea. It was the idea of imperium, of a universal Christian realm that could unite the peoples of Europe in a shared faith and a common destiny. This dream, the ghost of Rome haunting the medieval mind, was the vision that drove Clovis to the baptismal font, that placed a crown on Charlemagne's head that Christmas morning, and that lured generations of German kings on the long and difficult road to Rome. For 1,000 years, that dream flickered and flared in the glorious courts of the Ottonians and the brilliant, sun-drenched palaces of Frederick II, and through the long, twilight centuries that followed. The empire itself was so often a fractured, chaotic, and violent reality, a far cry from the serene and unified ideal it was meant to represent. And yet, the idea endured, a constant presence that shaped the laws, the faith, and the very identity of Central Europe for a millennium. What Napoleon's decree ended was not so much a functioning state as it was a long and resonant dream. Its memory would linger, a faint and ghostly echo in the grand palaces of Vienna and the great cathedrals along the Rhine. A story that was now, finally, complete. The ancient pages of its history were now filled, and the book could be closed, allowing the dust of ages to gently settle in the quiet of the night.